We also have a bunch of high-up folks from the big industry associations. David Merck is back there from API. Christina Sames is here from AGA. CJ Osman from INGA. And Patrick Smythe is here from SEPA, our Canadian folks to the north. And John Studi, AOPL. Can't miss John, he's the guy that's 8 feet tall. So for any of the public that really has questions about what the industry does or why they do it, those are good folks to talk with. Also just want to thank people who have donated money to help citizens participate in this conference. I think we spent this year over $23,000 helping citizens attend. Often they can't come to things like this because they don't have the money for travel or those types of things. And these 5 organizations donated to help get people here. So we really appreciate that. It shows that they're kind of going beyond awareness and starting to do more strategic public engagement. Also want to thank PHMSA for webcasting. This is being webcast live. I saw our Facebook page took off last night, especially a bunch of tribal folks in North Dakota. Welcome if you're watching. There's people all over North America watching us live, and I want to welcome them to the webcast. There's questions there. As our sessions go on today, people online can ask questions at the sessions if they send an email to that questions@pstrust.org. I have an amazing job because I get to hang out with all kinds of interesting people. Everything from a couple of secretaries of transportation to the upper echelons at PHMSA, the administrator, the head of the National Energy Board of Canada. I've got to know in the last few years congressmen like John Dingell up there on the right, probably the longest seated person that ever ran the House Energy Committee. FERC commissioners, our own board, and then I get to hang out with the environmental, what some people in the room would think we're radicals too, like Jane Klebb there in the middle. And they all kind of help steer my thinking on things, and you come away with a much richer understanding of the issues as you deal with people on all sides of that. I also want to thank the people that are in the trenches every day doing this stuff. As this conference unfolds, oftentimes you'll hear things that may be a little pushing the envelope a little bit, maybe offensive to some people. There's no intent on that. We're just trying to move pipeline safety forward as much as possible. But there's no intent to undermine the people that are out there in the ditches fixing the pipelines, or the PHMSA and state inspectors who are out doing the hard work every day in some boring little office looking at piles of paperwork. They're the ones that keep things safe. Or all the pipeline employees I've met on field tours that every day show up and do jobs that might not be as glamorous as sitting in a room like this with crystal chandeliers, but they're the ones really doing the things to keep safe. And also the people that are, questioning why pipes are going into the ground, or why we're putting pipelines in different places, or showing up at hearings and testifying. I think all of those things, move to keep pipelines safe. And you've seen my 3-legged stool multiple times. I think there's a picture of it early on that talked a little bit about how we need both the public, the regulators, and the industry if we really want sustainable pipeline safety. This event is really a place where all different sides get to speak your mind, but we try to do that in a respectful manner, so I ask that today too. Last year I got myself in big trouble speaking my mind, and I'm still paying for it, because at one point I kind of came out of the closet. I came out of the closet not as a gay man. We're going to hold that one off for a couple years, but as a keep it in the grounder. I came up here and I said that, after looking at scientific information, a consensus of scientific information about the need to transition away from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, I'd come to the conclusion that we really do need, as a species, to transition off those things as soon as possible. Now, I don't know what as soon as possible means or what transition means, but it's clear to me that we need to do that. And if we need to do that, that means that some of these new pipelines that are being built that are just for exports are of question. It means that some of this new production that's going on to get stuff out of the ground, and then the need for pipelines to keep those wells going, may be of question to many. And I said that out loud, and oh my goodness, I was in all kinds of trouble. So I won't talk about that again at all during this meeting this year. I won't talk about that at all. We really want to focus, like the picture there, on the critical infrastructure that's in the ground at this point. Because you can be a keep it in the grounder like I am, and at the same time focus on the issue of the 2 or 3 million miles of pipelines that already exist, and how do we keep them from doing any harm to people or the environment. That is what I had to start off things this morning. Thank you for attending. We're going to bring up our first keynote, who I am just thrilled to introduce, Dr. Brenda Kenny from Canada. You're going to hear that she has a little accent. She's going to say process instead of process. I've been doing quite a bit of work in Canada in the last couple years, and it's fascinating up there. I had to learn how to use, cubic meters and all kinds of metric stuff that people in the U.S. are too stupid to use. And I got to know Brenda when she was the head of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, CEPA. I'm not going to read her bio. There's bios of all the speakers in your packets. But Brenda brings a rich background, both as the head of CEPA, an industry association. Before that, she was an executive in the National Energy Board of Canada. She's worked with all kinds of nonprofits looking at different emission issues and environmental issues. So she comes at it. She's kind of got all 3 legs of that stool wrapped into one person. So I really welcome Brenda Kenny to the stage while I find her. There it is. Dr. Brenda Kenny.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. And I was really honored to receive Carl's invitation to be involved today and tomorrow, and also to help kick things off. I think the first instance of why he phoned me was because I had been one of 5 members of an expert panel. I hate that word expert. Let's just say a panel from the Canadian equivalent of the Secretary of Energy. Our Minister of Natural Resources, Jim Carr, had asked 5 Canadians to look at across the country at how we would modernize the National Energy Board. And that work ran from December of last year till mid-May, and the report was issued in mid-June. So I'll speak a little bit to that experience because, and I'll say for me, it was really an honor to serve on that panel, as it was a bit of a culmination and a great exercise in listening. Many cities, hundreds of presentations and submissions, and we made sure in our conversations that every time we met in a city and listened to presentations, we also had a roundtable dialogue. So you'll hear me talk a little bit about that. But as I got ready to answer this question, getting to a clean, safe, secure energy future, I also, reflected in preparation for today on some many personal stories. I'm sure all of us in this room have experienced why you come to something like this, why you work where you do, the sort of things that get you up in the morning around pursuing things you really care about, things you care about for your kids. We've all had learning along the way, some of it data-driven, but most of it, I think, about human interactions. And one example of that, a story I'd like to share, is a situation I found myself in a few years ago, where in the midst of the most raucous parts of the pipeline debate in Canada, and maybe the most raucous parts aren't even here yet, but at a point in time when it was pretty contentious, a group of us got together in British Columbia for a day. Very wide range of different perspectives, Indigenous community, environmentalist, industry, and talked about pipelines, talked about energy, environment, climate change. And the thing that came to mind for me, there was a great deal of learning all around the table, but at the end of the day, a young mother approached me who was a local citizen, and she said, I really learned a lot today. And I said, well, I'm glad, and so did I, and thank you for sharing your perspectives. It really meant a lot. And she said, I just wanted to tell you that when I arrived this morning, I was pretty sure that I wouldn't like you, and I was pretty sure I knew where you'd be standing on issues. And now that I got to know you, I know we don't always agree on things, but I feel like I can trust you, and I feel like I'd like to have more conversations. And to me, that small piece of feedback was indicative of what I've felt for a long time and what we'll talk about this morning, and it echoes what Carl was saying. We're at a point now where the only productive way forward is to enter these with open hearts and minds, and look for solutions that really matter, and don't come to it with assumptions. So I wanted to set a bit of context first, and because a central part of us getting to the finish line or advancing our goals, I would just say, let's assume our goals are tackle climate change and keep pipelines safe while we need them. Trust is very, very stormy right now, and I think it's largely getting in our way. The NEB Modernization Review heard a lot about that, so I have some thoughts about where to from here as well. The context is tricky. We've got a lot of disruption, a lot of uncertainty. On the one hand, energy forecasts are saying we can count on 150 million electric vehicles by 2040, which is fantastic. But at the same time, energy forecasts are saying we would expect more crude oil production globally, not less. And you think, well, how is that possible? And we have a goal of keeping our climate to less than 2 degrees rise, but at the same time, consumers are demanding inexpensive energy, and technology change is uncertain. We also have a lot of activism, a lot of anger, a lot of change, and I included here a photo from Canada where our Indigenous peoples are reaching, I think, a very special turning point with our country. Our government has declared its commitment to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and part of our work in the NEB Modernization Review was to come to terms with what would modern regulation look like if you truly lived that UNDRIP, which includes free, prior, and informed consent. A new way forward, deeply recognizing that any of us in North America, any of us, are treaty people. This isn't someone else's thing. We are all treaty people. So this is fundamental. So, but trust. I don't know if any of you in the room have looked at the Edelman Trust Barometer. I put the website up there. I'd encourage you to look at this and look at it again when their new report comes out. But they're a large global public opinion company. They've looked at where trust is going. They've looked at evaluation of how people are feeling about things. And it's disturbed me greatly over the last number of years that trust has been slipping away. And the 2017 one used words like crisis, broadly declined. Edelman is very, very concerned. The key findings are basically that, the mass population just rejects authority. Trust has declined across all quarters, and there's particularly major trust in media and government. 53% of people believe the system is failing them. And that distrust is so deep. Unfortunately, it's moving from concerns to fear, which is very acute in the U.S., I would say. Unfortunately, the countries are ranked, and this is a serious issue. So people have, out of fear, become closed to new perspectives. And aside from whether or not you like anyone in the room, once we are not listening, once we have the bias filter up because of fear, once we have statistics like 53% of people do not listen to contrary views, period. Or if they do, they're 4 times more likely to ignore data that is contrary to their own opinion. These are dangerous things because it really breaks down the opportunity for us to have a conversation and actually get to the outcomes that we're looking for. Again, a bit like Carl's comments on whether you're an in-the-grounder or not, we can still agree that existing pipelines need to be safe, and while we migrate to other clean sources of energy, we need to be looking at that goal together. We don't have to believe in a future of fossil fuels to believe in pipeline safety and to get on with that in a respectful and effective manner. So it's within that context that this NEB Modernization Review was launched. We had hundreds of presentations, 1,200 individuals, 10 cities, about 20 days of what you might call hearings, but they were structured in a way that was very inviting to folks intentionally. We were asked to look at a range of themes, including how the National Energy Board is governed, what their mandate is, their roles, And as I said before, Indigenous engagement went right through to this United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we became using the term, a Cree term, Akanakaski, which really means keeping the land pure. And I, in addition to my other career paths, have spent some time in academia looking at sustainable development. And I found myself learning a lot through this process that really gave me a great deal of confidence that if we can, in a respectful, trustworthy way, engage more effectively and truly, deeply engage with our many Indigenous communities, their worldview is going to be very helpful to us. And I hope that our technological Western solutions might integrate and be useful to them as well. So let's start and keep talking. The highlights of what we heard are no surprise. These pipeline projects are right in the crosshairs of climate change and energy debates. It's very unclear what the policy and vision is directionally. We heard a lot about the problem of regulatory hearings becoming very polarizing policy forums. We were doing this work in a period of time where a relatively new Canadian government had come in and was vehemently committed to climate change and to transitions in the economy. I know that you have lived that yourselves recently, perhaps in an opposite direction for the time being. But nonetheless, my own belief and what we heard from folks is that while we have a crisis of confidence, we need to look at the long view. Unfortunately, most governments are no longer positioned to look at the long view. They used to be when I was a kid, but long view is hard. Long view is hard on companies which are grappling with major financial issues and risks. Long view is not hard if you're a community member, and long view should not be hard if you're a regulator. So setting the table for ways to hold on to that long view and move through it is crucial. And as a result, there's deep concerns, but what we heard loud and clear across our country was that win-win solutions are absolutely possible, and there's a huge amount of common ground to build on. So trust and confidence is achievable, but it will take strong leadership, new processes, and much greater transparency. When we took what we'd heard and tried to move that into key principles, we relied on these, and welcome to look at our report. Each one of these had under it questions we asked ourselves as we drafted. What do we mean by living in a nation-to-nation relationship? What do we mean by alignment of policy goals? How would we know we're getting there? And at the end of the day, keywords here: living relationship, alignment, transparency, engagement, and results. There's no point in having process without focusing on, or process, whatever you prefer, without coming about to the reality that that regulatory efficiency and effectiveness actually does matter. It's the regulatory efficiency and effectiveness is not some lexicon for some linear perspective, but actually is clarity of what the heck are we here trying to accomplish. And so where we landed in terms of outcomes and structures was that there really did need to be a clear and coherent national strategy to realize these things that come together. This cannot be handled with energy over here, environment there, social there, Indigenous there. We need to have a coherent national strategy. If that's difficult at the level of government, I think at least we can come together as citizens and regulators, and hopefully companies as well, and paint that long view, and hopefully it gives us beacons even in the disruption and uncertainty. An independent energy agency, which you have in the U.S., we do not have in Canada, and the National Energy Board has typically held that role, but increasingly transparency matters, robust independent information and reporting matters, and the NEB's done I think a very good job of that over time. But critical data analytics, online, rapid information analysis are just, it has to be furthered, and we need a modern commission that is governed toward those outcomes alongside hearing commissioners. On decision making, our biggest recommendation was there should be one phase that looks at whether or not there's alignment with national interest, and a second phase where, if yes, then proceed with a detailed review. What we heard from citizens and from industry was there were, processes that would be years long from a company point of view, literally billions and billions of dollars spent to eventually get to a no that was really a policy no, not a fact no. So if you have a policy no, let's say your climate change objectives have moved and you believe that with respect to the in the ground or outcome, you don't want any more fossil fuel production. That's a policy thing. You don't need to look at 2,000 stream crossings to know you have an issue. But equally, a fair, open, transparent evaluation of what do you mean by macro GHG emissions, and if, for example, we're producing natural gas to get China and India off coal, and on a global level that's a win, that's a policy realization that might run counter to one's assumptions, which leads to yes. So you can do those up front in about a year, look at the macro issues, including indigenous interests, outline the concerns and things that have to be looked at in later conditions and regulation, and move that through. And I want to really highlight here, moving it through, assuming you're moving to yes and further conditions, really hallmarks the importance and the critical nature of a connectivity from the first conversations through to the eventual abandonment of that pipeline. Because all those conversations, all those assumptions, all those things we care about must flow through to what the regulator is on for both construction and operations. And equally, during operations, ongoing roundtable conversation and deeper engagement to verify that the things that were promised are being delivered on, and that the adaptation and improvement is occurring. Those interests must be brought up into the front of the process. And right now we have so many breakpoints. We're losing, I would say, wisdom. We're losing the intellect and the heart of knowing what we care about. And we're driving ourselves into situations that are intentionally controversial, are set up to be adversarial, as are many litigious processes, and are undermining our ability to both have substantive participation, increased scope of engagement, and ultimately better relationships. So in summary on that point, our report focused on really innovative approaches to nation structures. We felt it was important to have a separate office that could help. Keep in mind, there's not one First Nation. We've got over 600 in Canada. There's many here as well. And individual communities each have a right to have their traditional use and interests understood. They may need support not from a proponent and not from a regulator, but an ongoing crucible of best practice that they can tap into if they wish. Canada has very unique structure to our treaties, and also some unsettled territory, quite a bit of unsettled territory, and so that may be unique to what you would see in the U.S. But that feeds into a robust whole of government alignment and approach, and effective one process, one review. If we break up these processes and have EA over here and Indigenous consultation there and technical decisions there, we're nowhere near sustainable development. We have to look at these things together and do so in an adaptive engagement approach that embraces a life cycle continuous improvement approach. We do include in this the vision of a regulatory continuous improvement cycle, which is outlined in our report. And I in no way want anyone to take away anything I'm saying to suggest we should undermine standards. Standards are the foothold. Minimum standards are always there. But we need to be proactive in monitoring and engage together around what needs to be improved upon. React and take action either where there's an improvement necessary or God forbid where there's an emergency response is necessary, and from that we better learn and we better improve. So it requires also in that cycle analysis, learning, some reports on how's it going, some focus on strategy. There may be 1,000 things we'd like to improve upon, but in any given year, what are the 3 that are really going to knock it out of the park on getting better? And I think we're going to hear about some of those during the course of this. So I have about 5 minutes remaining, and I want to just focus on where to from here, and we'll invite your questions afterwards. Returning, ironically, to the Eidelman report, I was intrigued to see that their vision of institutions gaining trust is actually very, very similar to where our NAB modernization report landed. In the past, institutions and government worked for the people. Very good people. I worked there myself 30 years ago. Worked our best. I shut down pipelines when they weren't safe. I did all the engineering study stuff that would lead to better standards. Great. But never, ever, ever talk to a landowner because, gosh, I was the engineer. Like, why would I talk to a landowner? That has created a tension, right? I mean, influence and authority. How do I know that engineer has my best intentions in mind? How I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. After all, it's my community, it's my backyard, it's my traditional territory. So a new model that is much more with the people is crucial. And I also want to point to setting the rules. We take great comfort sometimes in saying, okay, something's wrong. There ought to be a rule. You ought to set that down. Thou shalt do this. Thou shalt do that. The problem is when you have a rule, it's solving yesterday's problem, which is great, should be solved, but it's hard to set aspirations and move toward continuous improvement. There's always a tension between driving to compliance and actually meeting evolving expectations. And I dare say that driving to compliance, as critical as it is, and as I said, I've been a regulator, crucial, but compliance never drives you to excellence. Compliance drives you to the latest rule. We need both. And instead of just having a static rule, we have to also enable adaptive processes. This will become even more crucial as we harness clean energy and as we harness technologies like I think we'll hear about in the room around smart pigs, deep data analytics, and understanding of how to parse where the next concern should be coming from. We need room to adapt and not be hamstrung with well-intentioned but outdated rules. And I want to say that I think there's actually a lot of good things happening. And while there are company laggards who should get hauled across the carpet, shut down if they need to be, and there are activists who are intentionally misleading, creating fear where there needn't be fear. And there are some regulators who maybe on occasion have been asleep at the switch, but not often in my experience. In any event, when you look at the responsibilities as they've developed in regulators and in industry responses, when we look at the glasses half full, not half empty, what's really remarkable and exciting to me is that in fact we are rowing in the same direction. There is a lot to build on, a strong foundation that is actually very similar across the two, whether you're looking at management systems and potentially some industry things like responsible care and chemicals or SEPA integrity first, alongside what's going on in government, which is, better planning tools, better measures and reporting. So we should be able to build on this. Now, in closing, a couple of personal thoughts. First of all, assumptions are misleading. You can't just look at data alone, and we're dealing with a very fluid, chaotic environment. Good decisions absolutely require external perspectives. And relationships that can challenge assumptions will ultimately give us better results. We need to be open to challenge. We need to accept tough questions. And rational is not a single truth. Our global realities don't always align. Like I said, we've got, energy issues and climate issues, I've yet to see a single energy report anywhere on the planet, including California, that is honest and actually delivers our goal collectively of not going over 2 degrees Celsius on a global level in terms of climate change. They are both crucial. And at the same time, anyone will realize local realities don't align either. Every one of us is both a consumer and a citizen. Most consumers will say, I want low energy prices. A few will say, I get the link, I need to have a price on carbon to get to a transition, so I'll accept higher energy prices. Very few will say that. Very few will vote that way. We're also all citizens. We want to have energy that's clean. We want to have climate change addressed. We want to have these things done, which is crucial and not necessarily aligned. We also have issues around looking for win-win accommodation or polarizing veto. So the third point is we all need to be prepared to lead. This isn't just about, them. It isn't just about those darn regulators or those damn companies. This is about every one of us in the room. And I invite us to consider the difference between courage and despair. We own this. Each of us owns this. Do you enter a conversation being cynical, or do you enter it being skeptical, probing, asking hard questions? I'm from Missouri on that one is different than you're a bastard, I'm not going to listen to you. Interests or fixed positions, being intentional about I expect results versus complacent, I give up, I'm in despair. So, change is needed. Yes, I do believe it's possible. Government is accountable for the roles, the basic rules, helping us create the architecture. Companies are responsible for their own operations, and they better well get it right, and there should be rules in place to make sure that they do. But each and every one of us has expertise, knowledge, experience to bring to the table, and each and every one of us is accountable for how we enter the conversation in the room today and every day forward. And part of our striving to be and expect both trustworthiness and successful outcomes. And with that, I want to thank Carl and the team for an amazing lineup in the coming days and for the absolutely superb work that Pipeline Safety Trust has done. And I think very much reflects everything I've just talked about in terms of how to move forward. So thank you, Carl. Thank you.
Questions? We have time for a couple of questions, and I hadn't set up the question thing, so anybody have some questions for Dr. Kenny? There's one up here. It looks like Czech Lesniak. If you shout it out to me, I will repeat it. Oh, there's someone found the microphones.
Thank you. Really interesting talk and perspective. One of the things in talking about the proposed process for looking at new infrastructure, where you look first is it consistent with where you want to go in terms of national alignment and policy, and then do the detailed review afterwards. How, in that kind of model, how will you balance the potential conflict of we've already made a decision that this is in our national best interest, this is where we want to go,
Yeah.
but then if you find things during the detailed review, the technical review, that says maybe this is not a good idea, how do you address that conflict?
Oh, great question. If you're interested in that in a little more detail, the report outlines a bit more of the thinking on that, but I'll use a specific example. Let's say emergency response, because part of that first phase is is there anything about the proposed project that is going to be surprising or different than what we've faced before? And on emergency response, for example, you know the product that would be flowing, you know the terrain, you know the the best-in-class emergency response requirements, etc. So our belief as a panel was you don't need to ask the proponent or the public, for that matter, to grind through 2,000 stream crossings, and that's typical in Canadian territory, to ask the fundamental question, is emergency response adequate, and what are the special features that would be required for this type of undertaking. Later, when you get down to those 2,000 stream crossings, of course there will be individuals who say, well, I gave you my views before, but now it's in my backyard and no way, not on my life are you having this go through. That's why the policy dialogue is so crucial, because you've had a good solid conversation about the types of measures that are essential given the product, and then you're talking about the conditions upon which you would cross that area. So you're not running into a situation where you have a very late stage surprise, unless it's something completely out of the blue that had not been considered at the front end.
One more up here.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Is the National Energy Board reorganization going to consider marine issues? And
Great question.
and also cooperation in response between U.S. and Canadian first responders?
Yeah. Perfect question. So when we talked about need for a whole of government approach, we also contemplated a need for better connection points. We did not recommend that the NEB oversee the Coast Guard or the Port of Metro Vancouver or what have you, but we think it's crucial that those linkages be hardwired, and particularly if you're looking, say, again, going back to that policy level, you want to ask up front, is there anything, if this is, for example, an export pipeline to not increase global emissions and oil, but offset from less clean sources potentially. So we could have a discussion about whether or not we can get to a better outcome and export, but that's for another day. I'll say, I'm not affiliated with anybody, so I'll give you my straight up example of what I feel. For example, Canada now has announced an oceans protection plan. We are, like the U.S., a large energy, a large, robust, advanced nation with 3 oceans to steward. And our Arctic is probably, second only to Russia in scale, plus 2 huge coasts, much of which is probably, I would say, much more pristine even than the U.S. coast, albeit crucially important to all of us. I was talking to someone earlier about surfing, so we know how important coastlines are for everybody. The Ocean Protections Plan and the science that Canada has undertaken on looking at the fate and behavior of all types of crude oil moving in our systems, and then a clear-eyed look at what does that imply about emergency response, time, technology, equipment, funding, must be in place. That should be in place whether you're running, barges delivering fuel oil to a remote community on the coast, or whether you're contemplating some other kind of export. Whether you're just continuing regular cargo in and out of major ports. Those are all the same questions. And for the Canadian coast, all of the U.S. Alaska crude going down our coast daily. My point is, those are basic fundamental no-brainers of good policy and good science that if it was in place and there was a new project, it's much easier to say, okay, now, does this project change the science? Does it change the things that good-hearted stakeholders and others have been working on for the last decade? What's new? What would have to be different? Do we need more tugs? Do we say no? Is it a step too far? What about the cumulative effects? That's a front-end question. To have that come up in year 5, after everyone's been through the ringer and a company has spent $1 billion, it's just not right. It's not productive. It's not fair, and it doesn't move us forward. Well, thanks, Carl. So the government of Canada, gave a bit of a response, but most importantly, they launched our review roughly in parallel with a review of how we do environmental assessment in Canada, and how we look at fisheries issues and navigable waters, which is a crucial part of the fabric of our country. So this government has made a commitment to modernize across a suite of regulatory mechanisms, and I applaud them for that. As I said before, there's no point in drilling down in details in one part or another. Does the whole system get you to sustainable development and UNDRIP and fairness to communities and economy? So I was just in Ottawa last week. I have no insight into what has become a memorandum to cabinet, but I can tell you that a team across government agencies has been working very, very hard over a number of months to try to come together on what would be a whole of government response to modernization, including the NEB, one part of that. And I understand, and I don't think this is any big surprise that that's moving forward pretty aggressively. This government the Trudeau government said they're committed to that modernization, and I believe they will. So I have no inside knowledge. It's very, very confidential at this stage, but I wouldn't be surprised to see something out before Christmas.
Great. Thank you. Help me thank Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you.
As Carl's setting up the next set of slides, all of you who are tucked away in the back, there's room for 10 or 12 more of you up here at tables if you want to move up.
We're going to move right into our next, it's kind of a high-level overview of recent and pending changes that will affect pipeline safety. So I'll invite Alan Mayberry from PHMSA and Dave Merck from API to come up and join me while I fumble around here with the different presentations. We're going to let Alan Mayberry here go first. I'd like to introduce Alan. He's the Associate Administrator of Pipeline Safety for PHMSA, which makes him the top guy at PHMSA when it comes to career employees. Is this your first time here officially as the associate? Yeah, I think he was acting as it. So he's not acting anymore. He's official, and
Some people think I'm an actor.
and I've got his presentation up, but I seem to have lost it on this. There we go. You're good to go, Alan.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Carl. It's always a pleasure to be here, not because it's New Orleans, not just because it's New Orleans, but I think it's important for us to be here to talk with the public and engage the public. Such an important voice for us at the Office of Pipeline Safety. I'd like to start off by saying, I saw, where everyone's coming from in your little map up there, and I just wanted to put everyone at ease. Although most of the people here from Washington, D.C., don't be alarmed that we do have somebody minding the store back there. At least I do have, and I appreciate John Gale, if you're watching, thank you for covering my role in Washington, but we do have people minding the store back in Washington. So I thought I'd give you a few updates here. I know in 45 minutes with three of us, we need to keep it a bit brief and a bit high level. I've got about, 15 slides or so that should go fairly quickly and give you an idea of what's going on and topics that I've picked, really show you today. Obviously, there's so much going on, and if there's something that piques your interest that's not covered, feel free to ask, either in the Q&A. Hopefully, we'll have enough time, or as I see you, I'll be around for the whole conference. So I look forward to engaging with you. Now, related to what Carl was mentioning, my new role, just to go over the leadership team within DOT and the PHMSA and Office of Pipeline Safety. Every name up here is new since last year, since we were here last year. No one was in the roles that, or these individuals were not. As Carl mentioned, I was in an acting role, but more recently in the new administration, we have a new secretary. Secretary Chow was appointed and confirmed early on in the administration, and we're very pleased to have Secretary Chow join us at DOT, and of course leading PHMSA. And then more recently, we're happy to have Skip Elliott join us as our administrator. He was recently confirmed and just sworn in recently as our administrator. Now, Drew Pierce, Drew is in the audience here, and she'll be talking with you just after lunch, but Drew is our deputy administrator. And then rounding out our current political appointees, Mark Sanborn, Director of Government, International Government Affairs. I'll skip down to Vaz Sagano. She's acting as the Chief Counsel. That's the other appointed position that's not quite filled yet, but hopefully that will happen before too long. And then back up to Howard, or Mac McMillan. He's our Executive Director. Mac really covers both sides of FEMSA, both overseeing Office of Pipeline Safety and Office of Hazardous Materials Safety. And Mac was new to his job in December of last year. And then, of course, I was officially appointed. I was acting when I was here last year, but then I was, officially appointed in December of 2016. And let me point out, too, I think, Linda. Linda's one of two deputies we have at the Office of Pipeline Safety, but everyone knows Linda, and I appreciate Linda's leadership as well within OPS. Now, moving right on into business here, looking back between last year and this year, here's a list of some of the actions we've taken related to rules that have been published in the Federal Register that are actually effective. There's the inflation adjustment for civil penalties. That is something, it was a minor rulemaking that was done last year. The emergency order procedures, we issued what we call an interim final rule last year related to emergency orders. And that's essentially an action that we could take on industry if we see a safety issue. We currently have the ability to put out a corrective action order on an individual company. But if we were to see a major safety issue, an emergency order might be in order for something like that. Excess flow valves, that's really related to distribution, and specifically that addressed multifamily residents and with a device that will shut the flow of gas in case of a sudden release out of a service line. And that one actually closed out a NTSB recommendation, one of our older recommendations. And by the way, the emergency order issuing that rule also closed one of our recent mandates out of the 2016 Act. Underground natural gas storage, I think we were talking about that a good bit last year, but we issued an interim final rule. It's the first time we've really stepped into that space to regulate underground storage, but that was issued late last year, and we're currently working on finalizing that rule. And then finally, rounding out for last year, what we call the OQ, cost recovery, accident and incident notification, and other updates rule, really kind of a miscellaneous rule, was issued earlier this year. Related to rulemaking that is in-house right now or pending, we have two fairly large rules there at the top. The liquid rule, or hazardous liquid rule, that we're working to develop into a final rule. That one's already been through the advisory committee. And we're looking to hopefully finalize that one before too long. I would hope. I hate to throw out times or dates. It's very hard to tell, but I would hope by, perhaps as soon as first quarter of next year. And then the gas transmission, gas gathering rule. I think Dave might have a few comments on that today, but that's a fairly large rule that we're currently deliberating through the advisory committee. And I will say I'm confident that we'll get to where we need to be on that rule through the advisory committee process. We've already had 2 meetings. We have one scheduled for December, and I'm already having the team line up or plan to line up meetings into next year, probably 2 more meetings into next year, probably March and hopefully June, to further deliberate on that. As I mentioned, it's a fairly large rule, has many moving parts to it, but that one we're working toward, and I think there's widespread consensus that we can get to where we need to be through the deliberative process of the advisory committee to land, and ultimately, publish a final rule. And then the plastic pipe rule is one that we're close to finalizing. That essentially just introduces new technology and also a different, higher design factor for plastic pipe. And then class location, rupture detection and valve rule. That's one that's actually in the agency now that's in the queue to be worked. There are a couple of mandates related to that one out of our reauthorization that we're looking to adequately address what's expected there. Essentially to give guidance and requirements for how an operator should respond to a rupture or a major leak on a pipeline. And then related to valves, where to automate valves, where to remotely control valves, where the valves are placed, and the like. So it's a fairly extensive rule in its own right. Then lastly, a new one that has shown up, you may not be familiar with, is what we're working on now is an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on class location. Some of you may recall we've previously had a public meeting on this area to explore options related to class location. As you may know, this is specific to natural gas pipelines, and as class location varies depending on the population density around a pipeline. From class 1, which is very remote, to class 4, which is urban areas. But we're looking at opportunities there for alternatives to the approach that was developed since the inception of pipeline safety regulations. It's also there's a possibility in there too for what we call a deregulatory action to kind of change the approach from a prescribed approach to a more risk-based approach. Again, it's just we're asking questions. That's what we do on advanced notices. Can't predict the outcome, but it's just something we want to put questions out there and just see what we get to a possible go-forward approach to how we handle class locations. Now, there's some selective initiatives I've put on the list here for this past year. Like I said, there's just a lot going on, not the least of which, are efforts related to 811 public awareness or damage prevention awareness, and really the goal of making 811 as well known as 911, call before you dig. But that's kind of inherent in everything we do. But, at the top of the list I have here for this year is regulatory reform. I'll get into a couple of slides here that will describe some of the executive orders that are out there and what we're doing, what we are planning to do related to reg reform. Now related to our inspection program, or where the rubber hits the road, and the 200 plus inspectors we have in the regions out there, there are a number of things we're doing to really enhance what we do with our boots on the ground. One is inter-region coordination, and that's just trying to make ourselves more efficient. It's a very diverse industry out there, but we're looking to be more efficient in how we inspect and, not ask the same questions over here of Kinder Morgan and over there in another region of the same operator if we've already looked at it in one area. It's just, some normal things you would expect that you should do to be efficient and efficiently utilize the time and resources. And the other is construction. As you may know, there's a lot of construction going on related to pipelines, and we continue to have a heavy focus. About 25% of our inspection time relates to overseeing construction, pipeline construction. There are a number of studies that have been worked on that continue to be worked on. Some are finished. The first one on the list there is one on performance-based regulations that we worked with the National Academy of Sciences on, and I appreciate Lois Epstein. Is she here? Not here yet. Not here? She's coming, but she was on the committee that worked on that study. And it's really a study of the effectiveness, the pluses and minuses. I guess our going-in thought was related to performance-based regulations as opposed to prescriptive regulations. The study was recently released, and I think I would encourage you, if you have an interest in that area, in the philosophy behind how you dial up prescription or dial back on prescription. I think that report is a great informative product that helps. I know as a regulator, it'll help guide us on how we approach regulations and dial up prescription where needed or back off. Another is related to natural gas leak reporting, and that is what we call lost and unaccounted for gas. That's been a number of interests that distribution operators report to us, and there's a report looking at the pluses and minuses, or the effectiveness of that number, and because there's a lot of desire to be able to, well, can you measure leaks from that number? And well, no, it's not really a number of leaks. It's unaccounted for gas, which could include leaks, but it's also a heavy dose of measurement. Differences in measurement, because as you know, if you put two clocks side by side, they're never going to be exactly the same. But it was a study looking at that and the pluses and minuses of changing that, the way we require operators to report that. Honestly, it's not really a good tool to measure or a good gauge of methane leak. It's because there's so many other factors that go into it. There's another one related to state policies on natural gas leaks. That's essentially a study on the state replacement programs. I'm happy to say that I think the states, our state partners, have been very aggressive in promoting rate programs for operators to update aging infrastructure. And I think as a result, we've seen a huge reduction in cast iron, bare steel pipe. We have more work to do, but we appreciate the work of the states in developing other mechanisms to find the right balance of replacing aging infrastructure, the balance between what the shareholder pays for and what the customer pays for related to updating infrastructure. There's a notarization study that's looking at the possibility, that's by the GAO, that'll look at the possibility of the pluses and minuses of notarizing all transmission pipelines. There's one that we issued recently related to improving damage prevention technology that we worked on in cooperation with the Common Ground Alliance. I won't get into, obviously not getting into detail on these. I know it's probably not helpful just to list them because you want to know the punchline. I'd be happy to get into and discuss further in the Q&A. The propane study is another one that we were mandated to do actually by Congress to work with the national academies to look at the effectiveness of overseeing propane systems that are 100 customers or smaller. And then finally, the Nationwide Integrated Pipeline Safety Database. If you go to our website today, you will see instant data that covers all of the U.S. Again, if you go to our website today, you will see data on enforcement and inspections that are federal-only inspections. We're looking to study how we can work to get the other piece of the data, 80% of what's out there, and that's the state data. So that's a report that's currently being worked on. Lastly, on the last page here related to a new initiative we have that came out of the 2016 Act, for short I could just call it the VIS Working Group, or Voluntary Information Sharing Working Group. And that is a group that will look at opportunities to encourage the sharing of information. Specifically in this mandate, it deals with, or the mandate dealt with inline inspection data, which has traditionally been a challenging area for people to share information and to make sure that we're always, dialing in the tools and improving the tools. But the work there, I think, has possibilities in sharing all types of information, including close call information, in a way that encourages operators to share that information and tool vendors to share it. So looking forward to the results of that group. We're still early in the process. Well, I think the study is probably due later this year. It's probably going to go a little bit further than that, but that's a very important study I see as we look to other approaches to encourage performance, encourage safety that's beyond the traditional regulatory approach. And speaking of that, the last one, and I mentioned this last year, and I know Linda Doherty is on a panel here and we'll be promoting SMS. We're really excited about SMS because it does represent another way to skin the cat. And when I say that, skinning the cat has traditionally been, we issue regulations and we'll never get away from that. We'll always learn from what we see out there and we'll improve the regulations. But we see SMS as a voluntary mechanism for the industry to approach safety, because if you look at the accidents that have occurred out there, and we see all of them, there's really an element of organizational failure that happened that led to the accident, aside from the technical reason that happened. But I won't steal Linda's thunder by any means. It's not my purpose, but look forward to hearing you and Sean and on the committee, on the panel on that. won't go into these just in the interest of time, but a number of advisory bulletins we've issued over the year. And okay, so why do we issue advisory bulletins? For a couple reasons. Most notably is in the aftermath of a failure, or even before a failure. If we see a potential safety issue, we will announce it to the world that, hey, we saw this happen, or we see the potential for this to happen. Be aware, take note, and take precautions as needed. So we do that as needed, and we issued a number last year. We also issue bulletins if we see a need to reinforce a part of the code that we see some issues with performance. And one example of that might be related to like high consequence area identification and the need to apply an appropriate buffer and the like when you calculate the potential impact circle for, say, a transmission pipe. And so that's one where we may say, hey, you guys need to improve in this area. So that's another reason we issue those. Now let's talk about regulatory reform. And there are three executive orders that came out early in the Trump administration related to regulatory reform. And I've got them listed here. And I'll go through each one individually. And I must reinforce to you, safety is paramount. We all agree. Safety is paramount. In the focus of these, I think we have an opportunity here to make things better, to make regulations more effective. If you look at the regulatory structure we have that was originally created out of the Natural Gas Pipeline Safety Act of 1968 and our first regulation in 1970, while we've tweaked it over the years, there's always been a prescribed level of risk that is addressed in those regulations that goes into prescription. Is there another approach? And perhaps there is. We need to ask the question on are there other approaches that could maybe change from putting resources over here to putting them in a different place, or to actually be more effectively utilizing the resources? Because after all, our focus is in expecting performance and safety and the operators understanding their system is to provide the tools needed to do that. It does no good if you're having to put resources where they're not needed. So I see this, the regulatory reform effort as an opportunity to improve things. And I encourage you to comment on the docket that's currently open that was just extended to December 1st. We're looking for comments at the department level on ideas you may have for regulatory reform. Now, I know you're thinking, some of you think, it's the federal government, this big monolith, and it's very, it's probably not kind of timid to provide comments, but we need your comments. We need to hear from you. And one other thing is you can also comment on comments. I would encourage you to do that as well. That's fair game too. A little secret, okay? We don't get that too much, but it is fair game. I know I'm short on time, so I've got, just real quickly on the three orders. The 13771 is essentially what we've coined as it's the 2-for-1 rule. For every regulation we issue, we need to dial back by 2 regulations. And then for the other, reinforcing the regulatory reform agenda, each department has established a regulatory reform officer. In the Office of Pipeline Safety, Chris Hoydell is assisting in that effort for us. And we have teams, about 12 teams in OPS that are working on ideas for regulatory reform. And then the other, promoting energy independence and economic growth. Again, all three of these are looking at reducing regulatory burden, but the goal, again, in our safety focus, which is paramount, is to make sure that resources are being put in the right place where they're most effective to ensure performance and ensure safety. This one is related to the other orders. However, this one is more specific to energy, as you can see. Now, real quickly, I have a update on mandates of the 2011 Act. As you may know, we're reauthorized every 4 years. There were 42 mandates out of the 2011 Act. We've completed 32 of those. We're 10 short, and we have 7 more, or 10 more to address. through rulemaking. As you can see, a few are tied up in some big rulemaking that we have, and then 3 others in a mapping update. And actually, it's not a report, but it's related to regulating gaseous CO2. We're looking to close the loop on those. It's always the last few bits that are the challenge, but we're hopeful to get those. We're very serious on completing these. And then lastly, the more recent act, it's pretty good progress, I would say, out of an act that it came out last year, but we have made a lot of progress in the 2016 act. So we've completed 12 of 19. And we'll make a plug for upcoming events. We have a workshop coming up here pretty soon on unusually sensitive areas and the definitions. Specifically, we're looking for help in defining coastal beaches, Great Lakes. I don't think there's too much trouble defining that, but it's essentially updating the definition for unusually sensitive areas to incorporate those. And so we're looking for input and would encourage you to attend and provide input on that. It will be webcast, and the meeting will occur in the Washington, D.C. area. We have a VIS working group meeting the end of November. Again, I explained what the VIS group was. And then we have our 2 advisory committee meetings. One, we're having a joint liquid and gas meeting, and then a gas pipeline advisory committee meeting. Those are in December, and those, a heavy dose. But the sole focus of that gas meeting will be that gas rule that we'll be working on. And then we're expecting next year to have a workshop where we talk about risk modeling. We previously had a workshop in 2015, but a lot of work's been done on developing guidance, but we want to publicly vet that and get input on that. So we're anticipating that in the first quarter of next year. Let me just close by saying this. I've fed you a lot of information, through the proverbial fire hose. There's a lot of technical information. It's a very technical area that we deal with, but I believe me, I understand the need to communicate with the public, the need to communicate effectively. And I know that to communicate effectively, it doesn't necessarily mean saying how we're going to make things be gold-plated or the like. I see that, the next Food for Thought session is on, are we talking past each other? And I think that's a very relevant discussion. There's another panel, Christy Murray from our office is on, related to communicating. I think in the current environment we're in that Brenda had alluded or had mentioned in her keynote, I think it's incredibly important for all of us to communicate effectively. And I realize while you rely on me and entrusted by the public to look at pipeline safety, to oversee pipeline safety, I understand that by leading off with my technical hand is not necessarily the effective approach. I need to understand your interests, to understand what's important to you, and to just make sure that your voice is heard. So believe me, I understand, and look forward to talking with you as the conference goes on the next couple of days, and hearing your input. So with that, Carl, I think I'm probably a few minutes over, but thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Alan. I knew Alan would go long, so I'm going to go short. Yeah, isn't there a saying about that somewhere? I would like to introduce Dave Merck, who is the manager for pipelines for the American Petroleum Institute. And, often when we do these things, we have multiple people from industry up here, but representing gas and liquids and gathering lines and distribution. We tried to pick Dave because API more and more represents both gas and liquids. So I'm going to let him talk about what he sees coming.
Good morning, everybody. Let me adjust this a little bit. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm a little taller than Alan, and thanks, Alan. Thanks for leaving me 5 minutes. I appreciate that, too. So let me first start out. This is my second year attending the PST conference, and last year was obviously my first year in my new role as the API manager, and very encouraged and really had a good time last year, and really got a good perspective on the fact that everybody in this room is concerned with safety, and that we're all in safety together. And I think that resonates, that continues to resonate with these conferences and what Carl's put together. And I thoroughly enjoyed Dr. Kenny's presentation this morning, and I'm going to be quoting or using some of your material as well as I go through mine. But I spent, as my bio has said, I spent 26 years, half my life, as a regulator, looking at pipeline safety from the marine terminal and onshore side of things. And again, the importance of safety to our industry, to the operators, and to all of you is clearly coming out with the engagement and through the presentation so far, and look forward to the rest of the conference as well. So what I wanted to do, I'm from DC. Obviously, we're the environment up in DC right now, and obviously across the country is unpredictable and challenging at times. So what I wanted to do is just talk to you based on where we are kind of at from a political standpoint, as well as from a regulatory standpoint and some of the uncertainty around it, where as an industry we're moving and how we're moving forward. Alan touched on some of the regulations in a little more detail. I'm going to hit a few highlight, but then move into really, again, from an industry standpoint, how we're approaching and going really beyond regulation. And Dr. Kenny mentioned that earlier. Compliance is just meeting the standard. We need to be going beyond, and I think as an industry, that's what we try to do through our standards process and being proactive across the board. So where are we right now? What's the environment? It's pretty clear, I think, to everybody. The political banter, the divisiveness of Congress and the Hill is pretty bad. There's a lot of discussion around pipelines right now, both opposed and for. And we've switched from an administration really where there was a lot of regulations. We just came out of the Authorization Act, which Alan talked about, into a new administration, which Alan discussed as well, where reg reform and streamlining and so forth is really the buzz within this current administration. Less regulation, regulatory reform. So what does that mean from an industry standpoint? This is a handful, and Alan talked about 3 of these, but these are all the ones right now. The top one is more dealing with a Buy America provision for steel, but the others really go to the heart of safety and safety regulations. And these are just 5 of those that have kind of thrust the regulatory process and regulations in kind of an uncertainty time. So what that means for us as an industry, as a pipeline industry, we're really not sure. There's still a lot of uncertainty. But hopefully what comes out of this is a lack of a pendulum swing between administration and administration. What we want as an industry really is certainty. We want certainty, consistency, both from how the regulations are put out there, how PHMSA, Linda and Drew and Alan and their team enforce things, and regulations that are improving safety, and also that are fit for purpose. And what I mean by that are regulations that are not one size fits all, that there is some flexibility built into based on a risk-based process that allows flexibility with operators and cost beneficial. That's more at the bottom of the list, but it's really the safety piece and improving safety that we're after. 2 of the big regs, and again, I'm not going to get into these, that we're really focused on as an industry, are the 2 big, one the hazardous liquid rule, and then the other the gas rule. And there's others as an industry that are important to us that we're providing comment on through the register process and through that process that Alan talked about earlier. But these are really the 2 that we're zeroed in on right now. All along, when the administration changed as an industry, we came out and said that we were not wanting rules pulled back. We wanted rules, as I said in the last slide, we wanted to have some more input into these 2 rules in particular that would they have modifications that would support what I talked about a little bit more fit for purpose, but we, at no point did we want rules pulled back. Again, we want these rules eventually to be put in place to bring that certainty for the industry back. So we're working through the rulemaking process as an industry, and hopefully we can get to a point where soon we'll have a couple of rules that that will be pushed out here and will provide some of that certainty. But back to Dr. Kenny's point, the rules for us are a floor, are a foundation, are that minimum requirement for safety with pipelines. From a operator standpoint, you know, we look to go and we are being as proactive as we can in the safety arena and going above and beyond that. And I'll talk about the standards process here and the standards that we're working through and working on through our strategic plan. And this strategic plan is actually on the liquid side. I know Carl mentioned both the gas and liquid. This particular strategic plan is liquid focused, but I thought it was a good example of how, as an industry, with our liquid pipeline operators in our collaboration with AOPL, we are looking forward, leaning forward, and being proactive in how we're thinking about pipeline safety. It's a new paradigm shift for us. This is a 3-year plan, strategic plan. In the past 3 or 4 years, we've had 1-year plans that were what I would say are a little more tactical. This is a little more strategic in our thinking and really looking to address emerging trends over the next 3 years. And the other big piece for us as an industry is it's opening us up to be more transparent with respect to and accountability with respect to how we're moving forward and implementing various safety measures and safety initiatives within the industry. We have 29 strategic initiatives that are activities that we're measuring and we will be measuring that will roll up into 5 or 6 overarching key performance indicators that we hope will eventually improve safety. And the other big thing right now for us is stakeholder awareness. That was a big part of Dr. Kenny's presentation and a lot of what this conference is all about, which is engagement, stakeholders talking with each other, listening is another big part to build the trust, to build the confidence. And so we've added a goal. It's the first time we've had a goal in our strategic plan, which I'll show you here, that is purely on increasing stakeholder awareness and involvement within the industry. So these are the 4 main goals out of that strategic plan. And looking at the agenda over the next day and a half, each one of these areas are covered throughout the course of the day and a half. So to me, that means from an industry standpoint and from where the Pipeline Safety Trust and where you all sit, we're aligned in really where the priorities and concerns really are. So these 4 goals are within the plan, and a big part of the plan itself are standards. I mentioned for us, rulemaking and rules and regulations are really the minimum compliance, minimum requirement for us to be following. We're going above and beyond through being proactive through standards. And this is what we call our standards placemat, and I hope to have copies here later today. They're being shipped down. But there's over 30 standards purely on pipelines that, as the pipeline manager that I oversee and manage, these standards in that process. And as click on these, I know this is an eye chart, but hopefully I have some that, whoops. So the ones with the arrows are all of those, and some of them are broad headings, are really linked into our strategic plan. And at any one time, we probably have a dozen of these being reworked through our standards process. These are required to be updated every 5 years, and in some form, we're in the process of revising these constantly. And that standards process is a very it's intended to be a very stakeholder open and transparent process where we get stakeholders from the industry, from the public, academia, etc., to participate in that process. And that's our goal. Haven't been always been great in the past. We're getting a lot better in that process. We're continuing to improve to make sure that it is an open and transparent, and we are capturing and listening to all the stakeholders that need to be a part of that process. And from an RP, from a standards process, we've kind of taken another step forward in how we roll and how we implement some of our key standards. In the past, we developed standards and recommended practices, and they've been more documents complete. We put it out, said here operators, here public, here's the standard and recommendation, go forth and do good things. With some of our key recommended practices, we've now taken that step of supporting the industry to help implement that recommended practice and those key safety initiatives that are laid out within that recommended practice or standard. 1173, which there's a panel on that tomorrow. You'll hear a lot about that, and you've heard about that over the last few years. 1173 is kind of our model for how we've done that. We've got tools through booklets, we've done workshops, webinars. We have a mentor-to-mentor program between pipeline operators, and on and on and on. And so we're looking to apply that same model programmatically with other RPs to help the industry implement. So we're giving them the opportunity to succeed in really putting forward their best effort in getting things implemented. 1175 and leak detection is one where we're in the middle of that process, and also 1174, which deals with emergency response. So new paradigm shift for us as it relates to the implementation of standards and recommended practices as well. It's a more programmatic, holistic approach to implementation. I wanted to really hit on, I got 2 more slides. I know I'm probably running late too. 2 more slides. One of the most important things, and it's going to come up in the discussion on pipeline safety management systems, and really one of the foundations for improving safety is really sharing and learning. How, as an industry, as operators, are we sharing within the industry near-miss information, when an incident happens, root cause analysis, things like that? How are we doing that? And I think in general, as an industry, we do a pretty good job of the sharing. Can we do better? Yes. There's more information we can share. Some of that includes sharing with stakeholders as well. But the part that I think we really need to start focusing on is the learning piece. So as we share information, and we just had 3 weeks ago, we had our pipeline operators annual pipeline information exchange, where operators for a full day came in and just talked about those types of near misses and things like that. What are they doing with that information after they leave that room? How are we learning? How are we using that information to improve and to improve safety? It's all in that continuous improvement cycle that, as an industry, that we need to collectively do better on. And that's really the next phase for us, is the learning from the sharing and doing that in a better fashion. And as I mentioned, that really is driving safety management systems. And a big part of all of that, it's not the only piece, but data management, inline inspection information, information on root cause. How is that collected? How is that used, analyzed, and again, how is that put out for the industry to improve on their operations? The last slide I had, as I mentioned, one of the goals in the strategic plan on the liquid side is focused on stakeholder awareness and engagement. So that has become, it always has been there for the industry, but we felt like we needed to really make sure it was elevated, and we were really putting forth that this was a priority for us. We also started revisions to 1162. We had a kickoff meeting at API headquarters last week, Karen? Last week. And a lot of good participation there. And again, the goal there is for that to be as open to stakeholders, and hopefully a very open process, and make the necessary improvements that we need 5 years later on a program where we as an industry have changed, and we've seen that change. So that RP on stakeholder awareness really needs to match what's happening in the world today, in the environment we're in today. In collaboration with AOPL, we we have created a tribal affairs pipeline team, or pipeline tribal affairs team, where we're really looking to work within the industry to figure out how we can develop and further the long-term relationships with the indigenous community and tribal communities, and from a best practice standpoint, where there have been successes, and again, how can we build that long-term capacity relationship with this non-traditional allied community that we have worked with in the past, but again, we feel like we can do better in that area and work more collaboratively with that particular stakeholder group. And then commitment to landowners we just published, and that's really it's a commitment by liquid operators, 6 key principles where when we're building pipelines, we have a commitment, and we're working with operators to commit to, as they're working with landowners on land issues, negotiating, that there's some core principles that we're following in that process that I think is important from the overall landowner relations perspective, and our ability to continue to improve in that area as well. So that's it. The strategic plan I mentioned, you can actually access that also on our energyinfrastructure.org website. It's a good site, has a lot of information, and again, I want to thank Carl for the opportunity to speak today, and look forward to, please don't hesitate to come up. I'm probably new to a lot of you in the room, and don't hesitate to come up, and happy to talk as well, and answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.
Well, I'd like to thank these two for leaving me minus 5 minutes, and but I'm up for that task. I'm going to speak backwards and save time. I only put 5 slides in here because I knew they'd run long, but I'm going to talk from a real high level of what we hear from the public that thinks about pipelines, what they're thinking about these days, and I think you heard a lot of the kind of the themes already. So I'm just going to go through this very rapidly so we have some time for questions. You know, what's happened recently? And I've just, what we hear from the public is the same as you heard from Dave. There's lots of uncertainty in the public. There's lots of things that have happened, and I'm not commenting on these whether they're good or bad, because I think there's lots of uncertainty. You know, there's pipeline safety rules that Congress and the National Transportation Safety Board has been asking for years and years and years. When it comes to valves, I think it started in accident in Edison in 1994 or something like that. So we're over 20 years and we still don't see that rule, and now rules that have been being worked on for 6-7 years have been put on hold and pulled back, even though they were about to be published when administrations changed. We see this new regulatory reform initiative, and we don't know what that means. It sounds like instead of rules, we're going to be going the opposite direction. There's greater support from the new administration for new pipeline infrastructure and fossil fuel production. There's greater support for the expansion of fossil fuel use, and by fossil fuels I'm including coal in that. There's a new clean coal initiative. And there's a change in the view for what the U.S.'s responsibility is when it comes to climate change. What's pending is there's lots of uncertainty, at least from the public's viewpoint. This whole new executive order, the 2-for-1 rule, how is that supposed to work? It's very unclear how that's going to unfold, because it sounds like that could be moving us in the wrong direction. Hopefully not. There's lots of unclarity on whether long pending rules now that have been held onto are just being reviewed. Are they going to be changed significantly, or are they going to be dumped altogether? Still waiting to find that out. Maybe we'll find out at the executive or at the advisory committee meetings in December. There's clarity about whether Congress, who has always treated pipeline safety as a fairly bipartisan issue, as they get more and more polarized, can they deal with pipeline safety issues in a bipartisan manner any farther? There's starting to be some hearings. I got invited to one yesterday in the next couple weeks, so maybe we'll find out whether they can agree on moving forward on safety. There's not much clarity on how pipeline industry is going to work towards these agreed upon goals of zero incidents. everybody has agreed that we need zero incidents. But then on the other hand, we see industry pushing back on rules. We see industry moving forward on a whole lot of new standards. So I think the public needs to wrap their heads around, okay, if we're not going to get rules, how do the industry standards work? And is the public involved enough in those standard creations that it just doesn't seem like the fox creating the henhouse? And finally, there's growing concerns about terrorism and vandalism, and the public has brought some of that on themselves by some of the actions that has happened. But there is also concerns that that's going to be used to remove information. So progress we've made over the last 10 years for making information easily available may start to disappear. There's lots of other forces at play in these whole discussions too. All of a sudden we see at least a temporary glut with both oil and gas, which the industry's pushing for greater exports to keep that production moving forward. And that's important in certain areas of the country that needs that economic development and jobs, but it runs counter to concerns about the use of eminent domain to put new pipelines in the ground and climate change concerns. We see increasing polarization being met increasingly by people living in their own echo chambers and just talking to themselves. I was at an industry meeting not too long ago, and they were talking about whether it's worth time talking to unpersuadables. And as they talked about unpersuadables, it dawned on me, I'm an unpersuadable when it comes to the industry. And I think that graph kind of shows, if you've ever been on Facebook, I've got some flame war going on mine right now. Go look at that if you want to see some nonsense. And both sides seems to be taking this on as a win the war mentality, both the public and the industry, which makes it increasingly difficult for us to actually legitimately address things like public awareness and public education and public engagement or education when we're both trying to win some sort of war. So I think the public right now has lots of uncertainty, and we're fearful that what we're moving for is not more engagement, more consensus. We're moving towards more conflict. I think that's the context that the Pipeline Safety Trust staff feels like we're getting the phone calls about these days, and I'm not sure how we move forward on that. That's all I had. I think we have time, because my scheme is to skip my food for thought session and spend 5 minutes taking some questions, and we'll add that back in later in the day. So I see lots of hands up. Questions for Dave or Alan or myself?
A question for Alan. I was caught by your reference to the upcoming workshop on unusually sensitive areas, which I will certainly try to tune in to from Canada. But I'm wondering about, in reference to high consequence areas as well, whether you're aware of an effort to create a database of what I would call high consequence sites. In other words, more specific than just areas. By that I would mean high rises, seniors facilities, schools, especially vulnerable facilities that are right next to, in many cases, or clearly within the impact of transmission pipelines.
Just a reminder, speak into the microphone for the people at home.
I'm not aware of a specific database for those. I know we expect operators to identify those as they identify, identify high consequence areas, and there are various sources of information for that. Related to the public meeting, though, that's really about revising our definition of unusually sensitive areas, which is a subset of a high consequence area. But that's what that is about. Really, it's just to specify what we're talking about when we're talking about coastal beaches or the Great Lakes, and as we update the regulation for that.
I have a question about the executive orders that aim to increase production, but if you increase supply and the demand does not increase, commodity prices fall, and companies are already cost-cutting to try and adapt to this new environment. So the new regulations and initiatives to increase safety will cost something and be harder to implement as you just increase production willy-nilly.
Not sure I heard the question clearly there. Sounds more like a comment that as production goes up and commodity prices drop, will that undermine safety? Anybody want to try that one?
Well, what I like to say is, regardless of our conversation related to commodity, and that's really outside of our realm, which DOE we're here, but we need to be asking the right questions. Regardless of where we are in policy making, we need to be asking the right questions, because there's more to our oversight, our approach, than policy making, which is important. And mind you, we will never venture away from that. And, our safety focus, which is paramount. But we also need to, outside of the conversation we're having on policy making, we need to make sure that our oversight is effective, and in turn the operator community is effective in making sure that programs are carried out as they were intended. That is something, changes in companies is something we look at, concern over, the potential for reduced, layoffs and that sort of thing. It's something on our radar that we look at, but so again, it's we look at everything, but we do need to ask the right questions to focus.
Travis Allen, Pipeline Authority for the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. To David, do you have any tribal members on your Tribal Affairs Pipeline Committee?
Right now, we do not. The group is in early stages. We've had, I think we've had 2 meetings, but that is that's kind of the next step for us, is to include discussion with tribal communities. Actually, the American Petroleum Institute, through one of our divisions, departments, mobilization, has been actively for the past 2 years working with more on the upstream side. On the exploration production side, has been working with the tribal communities throughout the United States, and we're building a relationship there, and potentially in the future developing some type of committee where we're getting key input from tribal communities.
Okay, because when you're asking about successful, we've reduced pipeline spills by 99% on our reservation by initiating our own pipeline authority and doing sensible development. And I would suggest you reach out to us. We did not have a DAPL protest on our reservation because we did public outreach, but I would strongly suggest that.
No, I would love to find time today to talk with you, definitely.
One more question.
The last question. I met Tim, and on here. Question for Alan, really. And surprised something wasn't on your list. Cybersecurity. Any 16-year-old with a copy of Tor can get a copy of Stuxnet and break into a SCADA system. Awful lot of the pipeline industry runs off of. How is that being addressed at the federal level? Is that not in your area, but someplace else?
Well, certainly out of 9/11, security was, the focus of security was Department of Homeland Security and specifically TSA. However, it is an area of concern, and we do address security partly through our control room management regulations, but I do think, it is on our radar. It's something we're collaborating with our federal partners, including TSA and others, federal level, to keep an eye on, because there is a safety component of cybersecurity. Certainly if there's something like that happens, if somebody were to tap in, there's a potential for something bad to happen to a pipeline. So we are working collaboratively, like I said, with our federal partners to see where we need to go next.
And I'll just add too, we're looking at 1164, which is one of our recommended practices on control rooms, and we're in the process of working on the cyber piece and the SCADA control room piece as well. From a standard standpoint, we're looking at how we make that more robust to bring in the cyber piece. So we're in the early stages of that discussion, but we're moving down the road as well to bring that into the mix on probably on 1164 and making changes to that RP.
Great, thank you. Help me thank these guys one last time. We're going to take our break now. I think there's some goodies and some fresh coffee back there. After the break, we're going to do our first breakouts. So in this room, we're going to have three discussions about some new data metric efforts across North America. And down in the other breakout room, we're going to have a discussion about corrosion, specific to internal corrosion, but a little of both. Choose your thing and be in those rooms in about 15 minutes. Thank you. Is that the one in DC? Yeah, right. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think our president or board president went there too. So yeah. It was pretty amazing. They pulled that off in a hurry too. Oh, all right. Okay.
the rest of them are working.
Oh, it's just this one?
Yeah, this one, somebody messed with the configuration of it.
Copy, then we'll start. If people can find their seats or we're going to get going, we don't want to be late for lunch. Come on in and find a seat.
That didn't work.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah, I got to put the song on again, I guess.
Either that or just turn the mic on and go, get in your seat, get in your seat, get in your seat.
All right, we're starting. You can go. I'll time him. I'll give him the hook. All right. New data, new metrics. Will any of it be helpful? How's that for a cynical view? As people take their seats, I'm just going to talk a little bit about why this session is on here and how the trust has kind of perhaps influenced it a little bit. You know, one of the reasons some of these metric initiatives happened is over the last 10 years there's been a number of congressional hearings. There's one of them there. I'm sitting at the end looking down at the industry folks on the same panel, and at every one of these congressional hearings somebody, either PHMSA or the industry, puts up a graph that looks like one of those there. And then I get my turn and I put up a graph that looks like one of the other ones there. And you can probably guess who puts up which graph. Can't hear me. Okay, is it better now? All right. What I was saying is over the last 10 years has been a number of congressional hearings, and we have a panel that shows up like that one there where I'm on one end, the industry's on the other. Invariably, PHMSA or the industry puts up a graph that looks like one, probably the one on the left, and I'll put up a graph that looks like one that looks on the right. And as we track back, it's all based on PHMSA data, and both graphs are completely and totally accurate. And it leaves congressional people who are usually confused by this point anyway, even more confused. So the industry and the trust and others came together saying, how can we come up with something so we're all talking the same language when we're talking not only to Congress but to the public also? About the same time, I was working with CEPA, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, on some information. I was on their advisory committee, and they were very interested in coming to the same thing. They see the public not understanding a lot of the pipeline safety information, so they asked us to form a group, write a report, and we brought a bunch of people together in Calgary to talk about how to move forward on transparency indicators and all that good stuff there. So that leads to the panel today, and first up is going to be Graham Emerson. I'm not going to read his bio, it's in the thing, and he's going to be talking about the Canadian effort to set a North American standard for pipeline safety metrics, a huge undertaking, and he'll talk about how big of an issue that is and how big of an undertaking. Blaine from PHMSA is then going to talk about some pipeline safety indicators that PHMSA's been rolling out, and the liquid ones just rolled out in the last month or so. A little more down to earth, and then the two folks from the NEB are going to talk about how they've got a lot of data and how they're really working to make it more educational and allow people to actually play with the data and look at it from the way they want to look at it. A pretty exciting initiative up there. And I hear my emails are being checked in the background here, so we're going to see if we can just turn the sound off. There we go. And I'm going to find Blaine's and we'll get going. Or I mean Graham's. Do Blaine first. We'll let Blaine do Graham's. That'll be really. And this is Graham Emerson, who actually is the chair of the CSA group working on a it's Z, not Z, Z260 pipeline safety metrics.
Thank you, Carl. I'm definitely conscious of the fact that standards aren't always the most exciting presentations. We have spent the morning so far talking about some pretty big issues, and this is a small piece. This is not a big change. It's small, like a light switch, and but it's also important. I mean, a house without light switches is a really terrible house. there's certain small details that you need to have, that you need to get right before anything else works. And that's really one of the drivers for having this CSA standard. I'll get right to the punchline first and then digress. So the Z260 standard is tasked with providing a suite of performance metrics to objectively and meaningfully convey pipeline operator performance. It does not define leading indicators, but it creates a framework for the leading and the lagging indicators to work together. It defines those common terms and severity thresholds for pipeline performance, and meets the requirement and puts in port the light switch type functionality for driving continual improvement. So if it can accomplish all those things, it's probably going to be pretty good, honestly. I can't wait to see how it turns out. I said I would digress, and so in doing so, we'll look at why metrics are important. It's always worth spending a moment or two on that. But I want to speak to the necessity of having the standard in the first place and getting everyone on the same page. The scope of the standard we can talk a little bit about. It is currently being written, so there's probably a comment that needs to be made about forward-looking statements. If Blaine and others working on the standard sway it in a different direction, then I'm going to feel foolish, having said too many details here and now. But then I'd also like to close with talking about the application of the standard and how we can actually get that linkage between continual improvement on safety and something as basic as safety metrics in place. So it was definitely a provocative title for the session. Thank you for putting that up there. So I'll start by answering the question, will any of it help? Yes. Yes, I do think pipeline safety metrics will help, but probably not in the way you think. When we think about pipeline safety metrics, why they're important, obviously demonstrated performance is the clear and simple statement. But we also have to think of the unintended impacts or secondary benefits we get from good pipeline safety metrics. Metrics of any sort used by leadership are a tacit policy statement. The old adage, what gets measured gets done, applies, but from an employee standpoint, you're looking at, well, if it's important enough to measure it, it must be important to do, and that's the first thing I'm going to do is whatever I'm being measured on. So what you leave out of your metrics is essentially saying, yeah, it's what's not going to get done. So you have to be very careful in what you choose to measure. Benchmarking, obviously you want consistent definitions and transparent and available data for being able to do benchmarking. I mean, peer pressure and embarrassment, I said inspiration on the slide, but peer pressure and embarrassment are powerful motivators. They on their own won't lead to safer outcomes, but they can certainly help drive those policies. Process safety is clearly the way a lot of us work, and it involves any sort of statistical process control, involves constantly looking back at how you're doing, making adjustments. As a driver for continual improvement in and of themselves, pipeline safety metrics, you'd have to have the right metrics. And the idea of having predictive metrics is certainly something I think we'd all like to see, but might be pie in the sky, perhaps. We'll come back to that. So why would a standard be necessary? I mean, more bureaucracy is probably not what people want to do. When it first came up, Enbridge thought, like, another safety metrics scheme, you'd have to sell us on it. Well, okay, someone did. Because it's important to get this right. There's enormous public interest in pipelines. Now, we've talked about it all morning. We'll talk about it next year. Maybe the year after it'll have gone away. Who knows? But for now, there's a lot of interest. And at least half the chatter is around safety. And so it's really important to get the data right. The companies that report on the data, the regulators, those putting out their data, don't want it misinterpreted. So it needs to be very clear. Transparency and accountability is also very important. Those agencies that actually collect the data and publish it, I mean, they don't want their requirements misinterpreted and to be getting bad data back. You know, it's becoming more and more common for us when we do our public reporting, our shareholder reporting. I mean, we include the pipeline safety metrics, but it has to be auditable. It needs to be done to a higher standard, you know, standard up there with our financials. So it's got to be very clear. You need an accounting system. Reporting overload, I'm not going to stand up here and whine about all the reporting that we have to do. That's just the cost of doing business. But when you consider provincial and state and federal regulators who collect data, the reporting we do for our board of directors, the reporting we do for the investment community, you name it, it goes on and on. And each audience, each organization that's requesting pipeline safety data is looking for the same data, but with a different specification, different definitions of what's an incident versus an event versus an accident, spill, leak, you name it. And it's all the same thing that everyone's after, but it's just ever so slightly different. And the implication of that is, again, not necessarily the workload, but each time you report out one number here, another number here, if it's all supposed to be the same thing, it just looks untrustworthy. You lose credibility. The companies that are collecting or organizations collecting the data and reporting it back out are losing credibility, because we're just constantly in the desire to have the metrics our way and according to our definitions, undermining ourselves. One regulator is an apparent contradiction of another, and it doesn't look good. The same could probably be said of the management systems themselves. I'm trying to think of a regulatory jurisdiction that doesn't require performance metrics to be used as part of a learning cycle. And I can't come up with one. It's something that everyone requires, but how we require it also differs between the different agencies. And so, same as the metric definitions themselves, if you don't have that consistency, it never truly gets picked up. It never gets truly embedded. And you want that embedding of your performance assessments into your continual improvement of your management systems, of your business rules. So that's a long list. Z260 is looking to address all of those points. It is, simply put, just an accounting system for pipeline safety metrics, but in its application, we think it'll do something good. A bit about how we're coming up with the standard. It's a fairly large task force for what I'm hoping to be a fairly short standard. We have excellent representation from regulators. We've got PHMSA helping us and working with us on the Canadian standard. Industry associations, API has been at the table with us all along. CGA, AGA, links to AGA, they're not directly on the task force, but CEPA. It's great that we've got this many parties. research agencies, 2 universities, an Alberta infrastructure-funded think tank, and then a large mix of producers, upstream, E&P type companies, primarily transmission companies, and local distribution, gas companies. The balance of the matrix was really important to us because we didn't want to finish the standard and then have it lose credibility because this is just written by industry for industry. Blah, blah, blah. We have tried to keep the balancing so that no one group can sway the course of the standard. The one potentially missing element was the citizen voice, and so certainly signed Carl up right quick to help on the standard. The work he's been doing has really helped kick it off and shown the need for the standard. But there was a number of other parties that put their hand up being interested, but then just shied away from the table. That it was, I don't know if I have the right information to contribute or what have you. And so we didn't want to lose those voices. And what the intention is to create even before we go to public review, an internal review committee of those parties like Ducks Unlimited and some of the other NGOs, other industry associations that couldn't participate. We want to get a pre-review of these concepts so that those voices still get heard, and that people that weren't willing to sit in a conference call for 8 hours and argue about one number can still influence the course of the standard. We are taking the view that this should apply wellhead to burner tip, which is certainly a big step beyond what's out there for metrics right now. Generally, if they're regulated regulatory metrics, well, then they're just for the regulated assets. This standard, we're looking at, we want to be able to compare the upstream, the oil and gas gathering systems to transmission lines in a very clear and transparent way. Same thing with local distribution companies. In the first edition of the standard, we have designed it so that LDCs, or local distribution companies, can be bolted on to the standard in the second edition, but it was too big of a bite to handle for getting the first standard out. It's on an accelerated time frame. Normally a standard's a 2-year or 4-year process. We're aiming to do this in 2 years, so we had to be picky. In terms of what's in the standard, what I can tell you, there is a single dimension for pipeline safety, and that is loss of primary containment of the surface fluid. Really everything stems from that. That's the primary duty of care, and that's what we're focusing on. The standard will specify 4 tiers. Tier 1 being those loss of containment events of the greatest consequence. Tier 2, lesser consequence type events. Tier 3, challenges to the safety system. These are near misses, the very, very small releases or things that border on fugitive type emissions. But they are also, things like when a pressure safety valve releases and it will release product with it. All right, that's a tier 3. That's the safety system working, but it's not what we planned to do at the start of the day, was to have that small loss of control. And so if that sounds vaguely familiar, it's because we ripped off API. There was actually a conscious decision to align this standard with API's recommended practice 754, which is process safety metrics for the refining and processing industries. I might have a couple of words backwards there, but it was a good methodology. In fact, it's a very good methodology, and it sees the system as the entire pipeline system as a system, not just individual pieces. It sees the products being transported and being accounted for as what they are, sources of hazardous energy. It looks at the individual controls, the layers of protection, and accurately reflects how the processing industries function. And so we looked at that and thought, well, that's what we need to try and adhere to. We are taking a bow tie, or continuing this theme and the focus on the safety barriers. If you think of your Swiss cheese model, with all the layers of protection that prevent an incident from going, or a threat from becoming an incident. Well, this is embedded in the standard and how we see this applying. Have the bow tie up on the screen and stuff, and the failure pathway is the progress of a threat past multiple weak or failed barriers, layers of protection, and eventually they become an incident. Well, those incidents, those events, are the Tier 1 and Tier 2 events. They show up on the right-hand side of the screen. Your Tier 3 barriers that we talked about, your leading indicators, are focused on the individual layers of protection. As we talked about before, a control fails, that's a Tier 3 event. That's the metrics. Those are the ones you want to count. The Tier 4 are closely coupled with those. Tier 4 being an organizational behavior. This is what was going on in the organization that led that barrier to fail in the first place. So it's not a terribly complicated system. In applying it, we want to see investigations happening. You have to have investigations happening, and here's the driver of continual improvement coming out of the standard. Metrics alone don't improve safety. Investigations do. You have an incident, you investigate it immediately, quickly. You dig down into the root causes. You figure out what layers of protection failed. You figure out why they failed. What were the root causes? And that's how you fix the barriers that aren't working. So under this accounting system, and once you have the accounting system in place, then you can start setting those rules. All right, we have our Tier 1s and Tier 2 incidents. Those have to be investigated. From those investigations, we find out which barriers failed. Okay, when we look at all of our Tier 1s and Tier 2s, how often are we seeing the same barriers fail? All right, that is the one to watch. That's our new metric, is how many of this type of near misses are occurring. Why are they occurring? Is there a common root cause that we're seeing in the investigations? All right, those are our Tier 4. Those are our ultra leading indicators. Watch those common ones. Now you start applying this idea of what gets measured gets done, and you will be measuring those weakest links until they get fixed. And you will be accelerating how they're fixed just by virtue of watching them. So, this accounting system for incidents, we like the light switch in your house. It's something you need to make the other pieces work. We see on the Z260 standard as an enabler of process safety. Okay, once you have it in place, you can do very simple things and set very simple business rules that make the rest of the management system function. Simple rules like you will investigate all your Tier 1s and Tier 2s. You will track and analyze your Tier 3s. The whole point of having this accounting system and the way we're setting the thresholds is to set them low enough that we have enough data to investigate to know how and where to improve the system. Okay? The concept of a black swan event is the catastrophic event of a complex system that no one saw coming, just by virtue of the system itself being so complex. Pipeline systems are like that. They are very complex. And we all fear that there's a black swan event hiding there, someplace in amongst all the safety barriers we have. So you analyze those barriers. You have to. My terrible analogy is, if you want to catch a black swan, you have to know a lot about swans. you have to be an expert about swans, and you get to be an expert about your complex system by investigating, doing your root cause analysis. And so the accounting system has to drive you as a company to collecting enough data. And so we've set we're setting the thresholds, and this has been the approach in 754 that we're carrying on. Set the thresholds low enough that you have a statistically significant population of incidents to investigate. Again, simple rules. So, you know, I had more closing thoughts, but I'm eating up more of Carl's time later. So I'm just going to simply close by, we do need to standardize. We want metrics that work. We want metrics that become predictive. Well, before we get there, we have to standardize. If we want the management systems to work, we have to be willing to give up on having our metrics our way for the purpose of reinforcing the system in general. Out of that, we will eventually get data that we can trust. Data that's not, you know, doesn't feel like shifting sands every time you try to make a decision. So that's my spiel.
Great. Thanks, Graham. While I try to find Blaine's thing, I'm just going to fill in some gaps. Because when we went to work up in Canada, we were pretty surprised. In the U.S., you know, we have PHMSA that sets the standards, and then the states kind of follow that. In Canada, it doesn't work that way. Each province kind of does their own thing. So you have British Columbia that has different data collection standards and different regulations than Alberta, and they're all potentially different than the National Energy Board. So they have a much bigger mess up there to try to kind of standardize than we had here in the U.S., although they go farther in lots of areas, like they deal with produced water pipelines and things like that, where in the U.S. we don't go near those, or gathering lines. So, you know, if Graham can pull off this standard, it'll go a long ways to bringing a whole lot more metrics into the system. And there's Blaine's, and you're good to go.
All right, thank you, Carl. All right, so I dropped the last part of the panel discussion from my slide. I thought that might be more rhetorical. Will any of it help? So here mostly to talk about new data, new metrics. Only time will tell if it helps or not. For new data, PHMSA doesn't have a whole lot to talk about. When we issued the underground natural gas storage facility interim final rule, I was quite pleased to look at our existing gas transmission and gas gathering incident report and look at part C3 and see underground storage or cavern. It's like, well, it's interesting that that's already on our form. And then the next thing I did was go into the data and see if anybody ever used that in a report, and they had not, which made sense because they weren't regulated. But there it is. So we basically hijacked the existing gas transmission and gas gathering incident report form, and that's what we're receiving underground natural gas storage facility incident reports on. We've had 3 in 2017, none with fatalities or injuries. They've been fairly minor, and so we may develop an independent underground natural gas storage incident report as part of the final rule for underground storage, but that's still being worked on. As far as the underground storage annual reports, we're going to start collection in 2018. And we'll be getting those reports representing calendar year 2017 operations. And you know, at the end of 2017, that's the snapshot for give us our first annual report data for underground natural gas storage facilities. Had a disappointing year this year regarding revamping the incident reports. Started a project back in 2014 with multiple stakeholders. AGA wanted more data on vehicular damages. PHMSA's cost-benefit people wanted additional consequence data, and the list went on. And so we put together a pretty comprehensive list of revamps to our incident reports, and in July of 2017, the Office of Management and Budget rejected the hazardous liquid revamp, and they've been looking at the gas revamp for many months and haven't given us an answer yet. But this sort of ties back into to the Z260 effort. When I was participating in one of the teleconferences for that, I said, well, geez, you know, if you're gonna, why don't we put in the standard that you give your metrics to your regulator? Why make me go through this effort I have to go through to be authorized to collect information from you? Put in a standard. Give the metrics to your regulator. Now, when you're participating in a teleconference and you're remote and most people are in the room, it's kind of hard to gauge what's going on, but not when I said that. There's not the willingness to proactively give things to regulators. So we keep going. We'll probably take another run at revamping the incident reports later on this year. We still need to get a decision on the gas ones before we know exactly what we're going to do. Not really new data, but a new website. We launched new URLs a couple weeks ago, I think. They tried to find the most common ones and link them up from the old system to the new system, but you might find that some of your bookmarks don't work anymore. So I'm giving you the home page and then pipeline data and statistics. The list of sub-bullets there, we got the pipeline operator safety program data. That we just started collecting in 2012. It's a way to link operators together. You could look in our operator data all day long and you won't find Spectra. But if you look at our safety program data, you will find that Spectra is an accumulation of several different op IDs. So it's another step up from our operators in being able to say who is Spectra, who is Kinder Morgan, with the multiple op IDs feeding into a single safety program. We have our national pipeline performance measures, which I'll talk a lot more about, and then links to state pipeline performance measures and our source data, which we're pretty sure is used extensively. So all the measures that we put out on our website, we give you the data so that you could check them, so that you could develop your own if you want. There's a couple links missing. We had a few glitches. We have a set of websites called Pipeline Replacement Updates. So hopefully, if you're online now, you probably won't see it, but hopefully by the time this conference is over, we're going to get those links to pipeline replacement updates and the National Pipeline Mapping System back on that list of categories on the Pipeline Data and Stats website. The NPMS, of course, has the public map viewer function that's available, and then the replacement updates are really about how are we doing on getting rid of riskier pipe, cast iron, bare steel, really old pipe, things like that. So that's an important set of reports, and I'll touch on it again when I talk about national pipeline performance measures. And then the last link there is the pipeline forms. So they're not really in the data and statistics family, but if you look there, you could pretty much find what these reports look like before 2010, and then see each edition as we've made changes over the years. So it gives you not only the current forms that operators use to report to us, but also shows you what the form looked like in the past. So that's the PHMSA website. Again, National Pipeline Performance Measures, one of the main picks out of data and statistics. The newest thing in there is the crude oil, refined petroleum, biofuel pipeline performance measures. I always have to stop myself. This is not a hazardous liquid performance measure. Highly volatile liquids are not in it. Okay, when we worked with the Pipeline Safety Trust, API, and AOPL on developing these measures, and we realized that really what we want to talk about is what are the things that stay liquid when they come out of the pipe, and that's crude, refined, and biofuel. We'll have another day and another run at the HVLs, which actually act a lot more like gas when they get released. They don't come out liquid, they come out gas. So we got to sort of find a home for the HVLs, but we wanted to move forward because we didn't want to go into another reauthorization session where PHMSA brings in a downward trend and the trust brings in an upward trend. But I'll show you something that's a little funny later on. So the crude, refined, biofuel, those are up, they're new. I'm going to talk about them later. Gas pipeline performance measures I'll spend a bit of time on. And then the farther you get down the list, the older it gets, I guess. Pipeline mileage and facilities and pipeline incident 20-year trends, they've been up on our website for years. Incidents first went up like in early 2000s. Incidents caused by excavation damage, we got to rename that one because it not only shows you data about incidents, but data about leaks caused by excavation damage. So you learn something new and you find opportunities for improvement, even getting ready to do a presentation, because I said, I shouldn't say incidents caused by. So it's about more than incident, but it's focused on excavation damage. What's our incidents? What are we seeing in leak data for excavation damage? Integrity management performance metrics, again, they've been out there since the early 2000s. And then the incidents and leaks repaired on federal land or outer continental shelf, there's some statutory requirement that we have to provide that to someone in the government. So we made a strategic decision that we provide it to the world. And whoever in the government is interested in it can come to our website and get it. So then, the gas distribution performance measures. These were published late 2015, and so serious incidents, significant incidents. We've been doing those for a long time. They made the cut here. The twist is we're doing it per mile. So as we get more infrastructure, our denominator is getting bigger. We think it's a more accurate view of the safety and the performance of the industry going forward to normalize it by miles. And we got data about leaks. Again, excavation damage, it's the leading cause of serious incidents where people are hurt or killed, so that's very important. And then the cast and wrought iron and the steel miles. I mentioned we have the pipeline replacement updates, but that whole concept of riskier pipe also bled over into the gas distribution performance measures. So you end up running into data about cast iron and about bare steel in the performance measures, as well as the independent display on the pipeline replacement update pages. And then again, miles by decade installed, older pipe has unique challenges and risks, so we have some data about that. I got in a little bit of hot water with my boss a few months ago because we were talking about SMS and key performance indicators. And I said, okay, well, I guess gas distribution operators, they got all the key performance indicators they need. These are going to show up in their SMS, right? Maybe. Anything people could do to help promote the use of these metrics, especially from an SMS perspective, would be much appreciated. Gas transmission performance measures, same comment about SMS, by the way, and they came out the same time, late 2015. And again, so here we're looking at more metrics dealing with HCAs, something we don't have on the gas distribution side. So a lot of similarities, but a few differences with the transmission performance metrics. But again, looking at it per mile. So let's not just count these incidents. Let's say, how does the count of incidents relate to changes in our infrastructure? All right, so then let's talk about the new ones. Crude oil, refined petroleum, and biofuel. Published these, I think, September. We finally got them up on the website. So again, serious incidents. That's our primary, one of our primary metrics. We don't want to hurt people. We don't want to kill people. So we do a rate per mile, and we have a nice display of the causes of those serious incidents. And then a new one, if you remember, so let me jump back real quick. So significant incidents right there on gas transmission, significant incidents right there on gas distribution. When we talk about the liquids, significant isn't there anymore. There was a lot of concern about, significant really is based on the operator's cost to recover from the incident. And there was a lot of concern that we were seeing an increase in significant incidents because operators were reporting better and more thoroughly, and everything looked more expensive. And we even do, what do you call it? We do cost conversion. So we look at it in a standard set $1984, I think it is. But even with that inflation adjustment, a lot of people in the liquid industry are just saying, money doesn't make sense for this measure. So we came up with the impacting people or the environment. Fatalities and injuries are in there. Spills in HCAs over a certain volume threshold, and I think it's 5 gallons are in there. So basically give us a report that's in an HCA, it's in the metric. If it's not in an HCA, the volume threshold's a little bigger. Did it cause, is there a public property damage? That's in the impacting people or the environment metric. So we did a rate per mile and volume spilled per barrel mile transported. Now the quality control on barrel mile transported is an adventure every year. Luckily, CO2 is not included here because that has our most erratic reporting. So, but this is our first time branching out and using the barrel mile data. Excuse me. I got caught by surprise by a weather change recently, and I'm paying for it. So again, using that barrel mile data as a denominator in, so not looking at just the count of spills, but how much was the spill and how does that relate to what was transported through the system during the year. We have 3 main displays. We do it for all the causes, so accidents impacting people, their environment, regardless of cause. And then there's a set of integrity inspection targets, corrosion, previous damage, so there's a few in there, the things that we would expect integrity inspections to find. And then there's operations and maintenance targets, which is a different set of causes that we would expect operations and maintenance activities to find and remediate before they become incidents. So those are the accidents impacting people, their environment, and I've got a couple slides that go into that in a little more detail. I'll actually show you the trends. And then miles inspected. Again, this is from our annual report, so we look at that by year and by the inspection method. That's the miles inspected performance measure. Within the web page, you can access the accident report details. You can view metrics by operator ID, and you can also view the metrics by the safety program view. As I talked about earlier, Spectra being a group of operators. Now, Carl talked about, going into Congress with one party having an uptrend, one having a downtrend. Not going to take that fun away from you with these new measures. So the rate per mile, and this is the all causes view, that rate per mile is creeping up, but the barrel spilled per barrel mile transported is trending down. So if the goal was to have graphs all pointed in the same direction, we didn't meet the goal, but hopefully at least we'll have agreement that everybody could walk into Congress and say, yeah, the rate's going up a little, but the volume's coming down. So it may not solve everything, but again, it's another way to look at performance. When you look at the integrity inspection targets, you're seeing the same thing. So it's not surprising. This is just a subset of causes within that other trend line. And then the operations and maintenance targets, again, the rate per mile goes really flat there, and the barrels spilled down. So again, those are just little snippets from the web pages that show the kind of data there. I didn't grab anything for the cause charts because I didn't have much time, and I think we're going to save questions. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Next up, we have a couple of folks from the NEB that are going to share their time. Barb Van Noort, who's the Vice President of Systems Operations for the NEB, and Catherine Murphy, who's the Project Manager on Data Visualization. And they're actually trying to make data fun. So good luck with that, huh? See if I can find it. And I'm going to do a little spoiler that, you're going to see a slideshow of their stuff, but they're willing to stay at the end of this, and we're going to try to get online if anybody wants to see and actually play with the visualization data and cut into your lunchtime for 10 or 15 minutes. They're willing to do that, and we can look at it on the screen. And I got a demonstration last time I was in Calgary, and it's pretty cool stuff. And there you go. Take it away.
Like Carl said, I'm not going to go into the detail of the data, and I'm going to get through the front stuff so that Catherine can show you the fun stuff that sort of makes it more consumable. And so the first part I really want to talk about is our results framework as a National Energy Board. What are we doing to make ourselves accountable to the public and to hold industry to account around our performance? So that's our results framework. That's some of the new metrics that we have. The data improvement roadmap in service of that results framework is really about where's the gaps in that data, and it's bringing in new metrics and new data. And then finally, the fun part, the use of visualization tools for analysis and sharing, not just for ourselves, but to enable it for people that perhaps aren't as technically familiar and comfortable with the information as we may be. So, sorry, I was reading the slide without telling you I was on it. And so how are we measuring performance? We have a new results framework. It's Dr. Kenny mentioned it this morning. The results framework is how the government's new program to say, how do you measure that you're doing what you say you're going to do? And so in building the results framework, we looked at the core responsibilities of the National Energy Board. And we are an early adopter from a federal government perspective. And so there's 4 or 5 of us that are doing this the first time through. And our 5 core responsibilities, the things that we do, is around energy adjudication. That's the front end when your decision is made on an application. The safety and environmental oversight, that's the life cycle part. That's the biggest part of our role. Energy information, we have a lot of information that we share with the Canadian public about energy supply, energy sources across all types of renewables. And finally, engagement. There's a tremendous growth of the value and the need for engagement. We have for our new pipelines that you've perhaps heard of, the Trans Mountain Extension and the Line 3 Enbridge line, and of course at some point Keystone XL will come back. For those ones, we have what are called Indigenous Advisory Monitoring Committees, which are very defined terms of reference that we're working with Indigenous groups to better understand the perspective and the information about safety and environment that we don't understand very well today. And all of those are about holding us to account. So we're accountable to Canadians to measure we measure our performance, and we hold ourselves to account. So those are new indicators that we put in place. And focusing on the safety and environmental oversight part is really the life cycle piece. And the key ones that we have in there are the number of incidents that harm people and the environment. So just to give you a sense of size, for the National Energy Board, last year we had 15 of those. So our data set is not huge in this space. And so it's less about trending as it is in this particular one, as it is about responding and understanding and sharing those with Canadians very transparently. And then holding ourselves to account is our goal, like everyone's, is 0, and working with industry, what can we do to get that to 0? Percentages of changes of specific incident type, again, watercourse crossings, as Dr. Kenny mentioned this morning, we have tons of them. And so we pay a lot of attention to watercourse crossings, and operation beyond design limits is a significant concern for us right now as well. And then finally, the percentage of change in near misses. So for us, near misses is a very small family there. It's really about unauthorized activity, which is the damage prevention space. We've done a lot to ramp up education and understanding and engagement about, because it isn't usually the pipeline companies that damage their own pipe. It's typically landowners and farmers and construction that are happening that cause that. And so we don't regulate those groups. So working with those groups is a different conversation. So we're seeing a lot more of that, but we caused it, so it's okay. And eventually, as we educate, we expect it to come back down again. And we've heard many people talk about this today as well, is that there's tiers. Compliance is important, of course it is, and we hold people to account around compliance. But we believe the management system is a far more systemic way of making those improvements. And finally, we believe that the behaviors, that chronic unease that is normal in your staff, that requirement to follow a procedure or fix it, that need to back each other up or speak up if you think something's not right. That is if that's a natural part of your behavior, it's really your final barrier to preventing a bad thing from happening. And it's probably the most effective one at the end of the day. But when we look at our data and the information that we have, most of ours is around compliance. We got a little bit more that we're building around management systems, and we have very, 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 very little around the culture and the safety culture piece, and we don't regulate it. And so we believe that these are the tiers, and by their size, where we'll have the best results in terms of getting to 0 incidents. So that's the kind of data we're looking at collecting over time. And so we've got to improve our data. Like 15 incidents in terms of incidents that harm people and the environment is not a big data set. And our compliance data, it isn't huge either. And so we're looking at what do we need to do to improve the use of that information to improve our results, to improve what Canadians expect of us, and to help industry to improve as well. And so with the people part, we got to improve an understanding of the information. And there's the challenge with transparency is that when they see a significant incident, it's like, oh my gosh, why don't you shut that pipeline down? And so how do we educate people to the relative nature of these things? And yes, they are all very important. And the other part is the technology. How do we make it easier to touch it and feel it? For new pipelines, for us, conditions, which is the things that we put in front of construction being able to proceed, conditions is like the hottest topic in the world when it comes to these new pipelines, from the NGOs, from the indigenous communities. And our conditions were these like 20-page documents of text that you would be hard pressed to figure out what the real condition was. And so we created a bit of a tool that people could go in and find, well, is this one in my geography? Is this one relative to the environment? Is this one relative to safety? Is this one about water crossings? So we created a little interactive tool that has just gone crazy in terms of people wanting to look at it and play with it. But we had to do that kind of separately because Catherine hadn't quite gotten to the conditions yet, so I'm hoping she'll hurry up. So we got all these areas we got to get better at, and what that looks like for us is just improving the data for both analysis and for transparency and for consumability by the public. So we've done a bunch of stuff, and it's just a pretty picture to say that we got lots more to do. We've done some data visualization, which Catherine's going to talk about around energy information. We've just released the incidence information, which is what Catherine's going to show you. And the pilot was what got us started. We've got a lot of work to do around improving our conditions remediation data and safety culture data. We're looking at ways to get that more a part of it. And we're going to look at using more data that is not ours. When you look at something like all the data that PHMSA has and the international oil and gas producers, what you'll see is that life-saving rules are 45% of the root cause of incidences when it comes to people. Well, heck, it's not a whole lot different in our industry, so I don't have to create a whole bunch of data to know that my life-saving rules need to be a bit of an area where I pay more attention. And so how do we grab some more data that helps to inform our risks and helps us to get to zero incidents? And so with that very speedy run through, I'd like now to hand it over to Catherine.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, Barb. So in addition to what Barb is talking about, what we're doing, all the systems that were just there on the last slide about how we're collecting data, about how we're driving performance, we're also using a spectrum of options to look at, analyze, and share our data. So this goes from the standard Excel spreadsheets to what Barb mentioned, publishing of Tableau charts. For those not familiar with Tableau, it's a leading-edge software program to display charts and graphs. It connects to multiple data sources in a way that you can analyze what you're looking at. Externally, we're pushing the amount of data that we're publishing through our open government, open data platforms. We're publishing these Tableau charts. We're publishing more Excel spreadsheets. Depending on what you're looking to achieve, you always choose the tool that fits the job. So recently what we've been looking at and what Barb has talked about is interactive visualizations. So this is a good fit for complex data when you really want to get it out in a way that makes it more accessible and understandable to non-experts. It's pushing us beyond open data to that which is useful, usable, and used, which is actually the definition of open knowledge. So about data visualization. So this helps everyone, experts, non-experts alike, understand this complex data, to understand the raw numbers, to look for trends, patterns, you name it. It allows non-experts to digest the information in an easy way. So what you're looking at here, as Barb mentioned, is instant visualization. So this is data from instance at NEB-regulated pipelines and facilities. And yes, it's public. It's on our website right now for those who would like to explore it. So it takes our instant data from 2008, and you can look at high-level trends. You can dig into specific instance. You can navigate by any of the 13 variables that are in there. For example, by incident type, by year, province, what happened during an incident. So as you can imagine, when you have 13 variables working at the same time, a simple chart is not going to suffice, and that's when visualization comes to play. The number of combinations are endless. I think when we were developing this, with all of the information in there, we're up to like 80 million different potential combinations that you can put together with this. So it really puts the power to the user to explore the information as they are most interested or as they see fit. So quickly, just to take a pause on this, and a question I get a lot is, what does it take to do this? What does it take to undertake a visualization activity? So again, this is about a spectrum of options. This is not going to make sense for all of your data. It works well for complex data. For us, we're looking at high priority, high interest data. And really, there's three things to get it started. One, an alignment with your organizational objectives. a serious commitment from from the senior executive team, as well as resource availability. So we're working right now with the largest information visualization research lab in Canada, which is at the University of Calgary. So we're using their research, their findings, their teams to help design this. As part of what they do for us, they both build and design the visualizations, but we also get the academic research included in that to test the utility of what we're developing. We are also contracted with a startup development firm who bring the visualization designs to life, as well as a visualization specialist who's done the same type of work with other large organizations. And it's not without challenges, let me say that. Whether you're talking about technology, it's breaking new ground, trying something new. We're also working within a federal bureaucracy. So that goes from procurement to website standards and the full gamut in between. But what it means, sharing data so that public, the experts, non-experts alike, can get in and look at this data and come to their own conclusions. We're testing the use of visualization for evidence-based decision-making from public, managers, staff, policymakers alike, right across the board. But it is one part of the large puzzle that Barb spoke about, but one that we're really happy to be sharing with you guys today. So, the next obvious question. Why is the National Energy Board, Canada's federal energy regulator, breaking new ground with leading-edge visualization? As part of the data improvement roadmap that Barb spoke about, as part of our drive towards regulatory excellence, and really as an innovative step forward towards transparency and accessibility of the information that we have. We're looking at our data in new ways, we're testing new ground, we're sharing this in a way with the public to be accessible and as understandable of this complex information as we can. And even internally, the example that you see up here, the Exploring Canada's Energy Future tool, that was our pilot project. And when we had built it and we put in the real data, and the data experts immediately saw some errors in their data that they hadn't seen before, because they were able to dissect, dive in, explore, and see little pieces that all of a sudden caused a very visual spike. So they were able to get there and find new things in their own data, which is pretty cool. In the coming months, through the university again, we'll be undertaking some engagement, reaching out to stakeholder groups to test what we're doing, see what the response is, what different areas of data that we can dig into, as well as digging through the analytics of how people are using these tools to continue to build back into what we're doing towards continual improvement and continue to testing to see if we want to do more and more of this stuff. Good. Thank you so much.
Like I said, she's going to try to do a demonstration when we're done here, but we have some time for some questions. One of the things that maybe my first question, and let Catherine just speak about it a little bit, is the analytics they have built into this, because it's almost a self-feeding system. As people get in and play with the data, they're going to track what people are playing with, so they know then where the public's interest may lie. So can you talk a little bit about that, Ming?
How you're navigating through the site, what's working, what's not working, where people are going, where they're not, what points of the data are the most interesting, so that we can feed that both back to ourselves, working within the visualizations, but to other areas, over to Barb's area, if we know that there's a high public level of interest in one instant type or from one region for that matter. It really just helps us feed back in both for my work with visualization, but for the rest of the organization as well.
All right, questions? I think I've lost all my staff here, so you can make me run around.
I guess this is more a comment than a question, but I served in the great quality wars of the 90s. I think people remember that, and where everybody carried around a copy of Deming and kept it under their pillow. And it served on all kinds of safety things for my employer. And One thing we found that was very interesting is you can take all these kind of deep dives into the data, and sometimes you get confused and sometimes you don't. But we also found out that you could rank organization safety performance without knowing any of this stuff. It was very simple, ultimately. All you had to know was, one, if the organization had good metrics they could track. Deming says anything you can track, you can improve. They got to have good metrics. Two, how much money does the company spend on its safety programs as a fraction of its gross or whatever? And finally, three, and the one why we could never beat DuPont until we bought them, is do the safety officers have the power to fire employees on the spot for safety violations? DuPont did. They were always number one.
Sounds like those are some metrics. Right. Other questions?
This question's for Mike. When you're measuring barrel per mile, do you have comparisons to both truck and rail, and also fatality rates, like with Canada when they had the Quebec incident that killed 47 people with the rail? Oh, I thought you said Mike. Sorry about that.
Okay. Wanted to make sure.
Is there any mics up there? Okay.
Microphones.
I got a mic here. We're good.
All right. What we collect is barrel mile data. It's a transportation measure. It's not a volume measure. So our operators have to say, okay, I transported 50 barrels, 500 miles, so that's 25,000, 100 something. That's my barrel mile count. So we're not actually collecting a volume. We're collecting a volume times a distance, basically.
Okay.
And
so
then
you wouldn't have anything with fatalities then to compare, because a lot of times I'll always argue that pipeline's the safest means of transport, and if you're anti-pipeline, what is your alternative for transport? And I don't think there's anything close, but it's always nice to get those numbers, so when you're having that disagreement, you can have facts behind it instead of just positions.
I think our hazardous material group was looking at this very question for crude, at least for. Christina can answer the question for me. Thank you.
Only because I used to work for all of you. DOT has at a higher level all transportation modes, and they rank all the incidents per the transportation mode. It's not within PHMSA, but it's within DOT, and it does rank in pipelines are the safest.
Other questions?
So I've got a question for anybody that would like to answer it. So I found the presentations very intriguing. You know, I'm always have conflicting opinions. Some people will say, just show me the information very simply. I just want to see general trends. I don't want any confusing background. Then others of us would be like, oh, I really want to dig into this. If I change this one, then I can change that, and I can see the influences. So you have, Carl, different people in the public, different users that want to see different things. And my question to you is, and it goes a step further, is some people will say, I want to see the data, I want to be able to access it, I want to be able to manipulate it, but I also want someone to tell me what it means. Putting a chart up there, I may not have the background information to understand what that chart is actually telling me. And that is a vulnerability, because if you misunderstand the data you're looking at, you could head off in the wrong direction. So my question is, and I guess I'm pointing this to Carl, you know, representing the public in general, what would you like to see? And you cannot say I want it all. I mean, do you know, an interactive map like this, do you like the simplistic charts? Do you want more analysis from the people that are putting it together? What works for you best?
Well, I want it all. But I think you want it all so you can toggle and turn some of it off. And maybe the NEB is getting there with their visualization, because I think it's all there, but and I haven't had a chance to play with it enough to know whether you can simplify it so you can look at easy things start there, but then you can dive deeper as you get comfortable with that. I found myself being uncomfortable during some of these presentations. Blaine was trying to go a mile a minute so he could get within his 15 minutes, and it was like, oh, people watching this on the website are going to have no idea what he's talking about just because of the terminology. So I think we can put, the new data that PHMSA's put up, like the incidents that affect people in the environment, are great. But that's going to mean something different to everybody without some clear explanations in it, and then you get too text heavy. So it's a double-edged sword.
Well, we did take a stab at the text. If you go to the performance measures for crude, refined, and biofuel, it takes a good deal of screen text up, but all the criteria are there. And we did put some observations about what's the trend line doing, especially when it comes to causes, highlighting what causes made up the greatest part of the trend lines. So we're trying. And the Tableau thing's interesting. I'm looking forward to playing with that.
Hi, this is Sarah Gossman. So Blaine, I think you said that the incident reporting data the rule that you wanted to put out that would gather more data didn't make it through cost-benefit analysis in OIRA. And I'm wondering what the issue was and what you see as the possibilities for convincing economists that data is actually really necessary for pipeline safety regulation, because it seems to me this is an ongoing issue about the way that, particularly our federal regulatory framework works, but also specific to this kind of risk-based analysis, where you don't have that many incidents, right, to base your avoided costs on, essentially, for why you might need this data. So.
All right, well, just to clarify, it was not a rulemaking. What it was information collection renewal, which there's no cost-benefit analysis. It's much less formal than a rulemaking, and didn't really get any formal feedback from OMB. Just got a no.
I had a question for Blaine. Jog my memory on the DIMP reporting, the annual reporting. They don't really record service line mileage. It's number of services, right? So do you guys use an average for the number if you're converting that to mileage issues?
We convert service count, and you're absolutely right. On the gas distribution annual report, we get service counts. The operator also has the opportunity to tell us their average service length. If they put an average service length into the report, we use that to do the math for that particular report. If they don't, we use 90 feet.
And just one last commentary too. Don't lose sight. I'm on the SMS subcommittee type stuff, whatever we ever figure that out to be. Though I'm highly supportive of it for 40 years. We called it something different 40 years ago. But, the key issues of the parametrics and DIMP, I've had enough involvement in various states now in looking at issues that serves as an excellent role model, at least for gas distribution. Doesn't mean that's the answer. So don't give up on that parametric. Some of the more progressive companies have gone the next step in that process, interestingly, on the data presentation to their management and going to mapping and various things. So you'll probably hear some more about that tomorrow. So you're on the right trail from where I'm going. So hang in there.
Can I get the screen back up here? I just put up the NEB site just to give you a taste of what's coming. You can see, depending on what you click on, it's going to show you all kinds of fancy stuff, and I don't know how to work it, so we'd have to get Catherine to do it for us. But if people want to stay around, it is 1 minute to lunchtime. We have time for one more question. We got one more question.
So Blaine, I would be interested to know what kind of changes that y'all, or additional data that you would collect on the incident tracking. The accident report form itself is several pages and takes a good bit of time to complete, and I just am curious as to what additional data would be of value.
I think I can give you a docket number and a website where you can go and you'll see the proposed red lines for the hazardous liquid accident report and all 3 gas reports.
Look at that, I found companies, and if you put the little arrow on Enbridge, it shows you all kinds of stuff that I don't understand. You want to explain this to us, Graham? All right. It is lunch break. Does anybody want to stay and watch this for a few minutes? Catherine's going to be here, so feel free to stay. Other people, lunch is down the stairs or down the elevator 1, and way back you're trying to head to the farthest corner down here to the Royal Room. Thank you. We'll pick on TransCanada. They're not sitting up here.
Yeah, that's right. That's their penance for not sitting up here.
Let's see if I can downsize it.
Yeah. I'll go in the audience so I can ask a question.
Oh, okay. Challenge me.
Yeah. I mean, thinking back on it, every one of these things is so complicated. We could spend an hour on just yours easily to get to the public so they understand that there's all this data we have to figure out how to talk about first. Yeah, we can set right the standard. But I think it was good to pick one where people can dig in deeper if they want.
Yep. Best you can do.
Yeah.
You only have so much time.
Yep. Stand up, make yourself available to explain things.
Now they know where to
all through lunch.
Yeah.
Waiting.
All right. Anybody that wants to watch this, why don't you come up here in the first couple rows and we'll do a demonstration. Oh, hi. Nice to put a face to it. Thank you. How was your trip in? All right?
Oh, yeah. There's some weather coming in, yeah. It's fine. You got here. There you go. There you go. It's just a little extra bumpier than perhaps one would want. Yeah. Catherine, nice to meet you. Lovely to meet you.
I should have got it.
I'm very jealous. I will be finding one of those.
It should be on the
Finding one of those.
pretty sure.
I've never been either. This is my first foray. It's a real interesting group of folks, which makes it more interesting. So you want to mix up the views. Okay, should I get started?
Thank you.
Okay.
Go for it.
All right.
All right. Here goes
Is this
the
on?
demonstration. You're cutting into
The
my
demo
lunchtime
begins.
here, folks.
Yeah. We have to get Carl his lunch, so I will get started. Here we go. Okay, so the way that I'm going to start is I'm just going to try and shrink it down. There we go. And, okay. So as I mentioned, this is all available on our website right now at the NEB website. The way that we're starting, oh, yeah.
People can take their conversations out of the room so other people can hear this.
Okay. This is a new laptop, so there we go. Okay, I'm just going to go straight home so you can see how to navigate. We try to make it as easy as possible. Government websites are not necessarily known for their ease of navigation. However, right-hand side here, you'll see a data visualization box. We have the instance and our energy futures. The energy futures is our forecast data that we do on energy demand and supply for Canada, and then the instance tool here. So what we have here, again, as I mentioned, so this is our instant data from 2008 to present. At this time, we're updating it quarterly just to align with some other products that we have. So we start with a basic view that we're looking at provinces and instant types. Anything you roll over, you see the connection between the variables or the columns, whatever you want to call it. I'll refer to them as columns just for simplicity's sake. So right now I'm looking at New Brunswick and how the instants trend over. So the majority of them are a release of substance. I can click on any of the categories within a column, and I get the list of instants that have that attached to them. So I know that 82 of the just over 1,000, and this is a bit of an eye test, I'm sorry, 85 of the over 1,000 instants occurred in New Brunswick. Now, I can choose to add anything here. So if I'm really quite interested in release of substances, I can pull out release type. Equally, I can then pull out substance. So right now I'm building what I like to call it as a story. So I'm digging in between. So you see here, the majority of what we're looking at here, again, I've selected in New Brunswick. Majority are release of substance, which the majority of them, gas, and it was a natural gas suite. Now, the real, I think is pretty neat, is of these 85 instances, of course, I can scroll through this list here, and I can select a single one. So right now you see that dark line appear between the columns, and you're digging into that one. So when I pull out additional columns, the story continues to build and build. I'll just take a pause here to show you some of the navigation features that we have on the right-hand side. So we have our social media sharing and email sharing. The neat thing about the way that we've set this up and some of the back-end work that we've really focused on is that when I select to send by email or through Facebook or whatnot, you get the exact URL as to how you've set up your page, so that when you're sharing this, you have that relationship back, so you're not making somebody, you know, trying to write out an email to say, okay, then click this, click this, click this. It's brought together for you. And it also helps on the other side. So if somebody's out on social media saying, oh my gosh, look at this, that, and the other thing, you can kind of, dig in and then test that to make sure that the facts are valid as well. Yeah. Oh. So the size is in relation to the number of incidents overall. There's different reordering features, but that's the general rule. So I'm just going to pull out another way that we can look at this. This is one way that I tend to look at more for a high-level overview. So this has brought out the map of Canada, and I can click and it'll pull up whatever column is on the left there. You'll get color-coded into the map. This is really meant as an overview tool. You can't dive into the map, but it gives you that high-level overview of what's happening and where. Again, to build out the story that most interests you or that you really want to learn more about. One of the pieces that I'll bring out here, again, system components involved. You can see what's happening if it was a pipeline involved, down to a pumping station, and then all of these little guys down here of what happened at a facility and onward. You can also star or favorite instance. I like to think of this as the shopping cart for those of us who do online shopping. And these are saved, and you'll see them populated now down here in the bottom left-hand corner. So if you want to compare incidents as you kind of navigate through, then you have that ability to kind of save them off to the side so that you can bring them back into your comparison at any time. Another neat feature here, this is about how you can kind of dig in and explore through the data, is that I have the ability to show only a specific category or hide that one. For example, I'll go to BC here, British Columbia, and I just want to look at that because that's where I'm living. I really want to get a better sense of what's happening there. So now I've isolated down to just over 200 incidents, and then you go the same way. You want to look at fires, you can do that. You can add in company to see what's happening there. Again, the thickness of the line is to the number of incidents that pertain. And then you can bring in these categories. What happened and why it happened. This is a really interesting part of the research and the time that we've spent with the University of Calgary. Their expertise is on information visualization. This is a hugely emerging field as organizations across everywhere are dealing with, what the heck do we do with all of this data? How do we interpret ourselves and then try and share it publicly as a second layer to that challenge? So these are our causes. These are our cause categories. that we have put together and then used terminology after a lot of fruitless discussions of what's an immediate cause versus a basic cause. And it's, okay, tell me again what the difference is. What? For non-technical people, that was just, it just didn't click. And eventually, an amazing person on Barb's team said, guys, it's what happened and why it happened. Light bulb. Let's use that. Again, not making somebody having to be an expert in this area to understand what we're talking about and get the meaning out of that data. So we can click, go any way you want. I now know that in BC, incorrect operation was one of the causes of 63 incidents, and I want to look at this one in Fort Nelson, and I follow that path line. So I see that it was BC, release of substance, it was West Coast carrying on business as Spectra, incorrect operation as well as external interference, and then over to why it happened as well, and that just maps readily. You can continue to add on as many columns as interests you, and away you go. Aha! Sir, oh, sorry. That's part of our thinking for version 2. We have quite a parking lot of ideas such as that. When we had to get this out, we decided to go with get the Honda out the door before going for the Porsche. But that's definitely one that we've been talking about, as well as the concept that came up earlier from the presentations, normalizing the data. Not sure how we would do it, whether it be by kilometer of regulated pipeline or number of facilities or whatnot, but we are looking to have that conversation internally as well. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So we kept with a certain amount per, but what I would highlight is that for any of those question marks that you see, if you want to understand what we mean by operation beyond design limits, we have it there. Exactly. You got it. And when we started working with Barb's team on this, the biggest piece that we were pushing towards is, can we please provide some context? Some context for when we say an incident, what does that mean? Is it big? Is it small? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So that's exactly one of the ways that we've tried to weave this in. Yeah. Did you have a question, ma'am? Right. Good. And that's why you see that it kind of all of a sudden got messy on my 2 columns there at the side, the what happened and why it happened, is because we don't just map to one. We map to as many as is required to get the data. And I should also mention that what we're looking at here, and to the question that came earlier about people's ability or need or want to look at this in a multitude of ways, what we're presenting here is really a subset of the full incident data that we have. We publish that online as well, and I should say all of this is available through Open Government. The source code for this is available through Open Government. But the granular data that you're talking about, when you get down to that level, it's available, but we're not using it here. We've aggregated some of the distinct causes into categories, because I think our full incident data is a couple hundred columns long, and it would help. It would not help with that context and meaning piece, but it's available. Yeah, to get that big picture at the same time, we tried our best to allow for that high level trending patterns, to being able to see at that level, but also provide the ability to zoom in and zone in on single instance as well. Yeah. Did you have another question? Sure. So there's no search feature. You clue through, and for most of these, I'm just going to reset it so it becomes a little bit clearer. We have alphabetized, but one of the features that we're looking at as part of our parking lot is some sort of cat eye zoom in so that you can see, because a lot of the companies are too small, they might have only had a couple instances.